Leave me a donut over there.
He's trying to sell those.
All right, let's get started. Everybody turn in their tests? Okay. Next week we have, as you notice here, we had a swap. The propagation class had to be swapped out because they're having a funeral over here at the St. Andrew's Church. So we had to switch the 18th, move it to the 25th, and the 25th to the 18th. So for the 25th, the one that's moving up is going to be, you got chapter 10, you got a test on it.
Can we already turn that in? Chapter 10.
Chapter 10, yes you did, earlier for vegetables. I don't know why it's down there again. And then on the propagation class, you'll have chapter 4 test. So anyway, be sure you pay attention to that. Did everybody mute their phones? Okay. Everybody sign in? No. No? All right. So anyway, propagation is not next week. It's on the 25th. So be sure you remember that. Make note on your schedule. All right. Our first speaker, you've known her. She presented weeds last time.
Are you trying to tell me that?
Yes.
You're supposed to say nicer things.
Yes, ma'am. Yeah. Our organization president is here to present to you greenhouses. She's got a lot of good information on greenhouses and what you can do and what's available. So, Kay, it's your turn.
It's my turn, I get to talk now.
You get to talk now. So let's welcome Kay.
Only for a minute, though. Only for a minute.
Here, you want this? That's a speaker for that kid.
I'm supposed to wear this? So Paul can, hold on, let me put my props down. Maybe. Do you know what a klutz I am? We won't discuss what a klutz I am. Hi, guys. Before I get into my topic, which is highly technical, okay, I want you to know this is very... I want to thank those of you who helped with the plant sale, and those of you who are going to help with the plant sales coming up. And if you don't like doing plant sales, we'll find something else, okay? We're really good at that, so just in case you get bored. Today I'm going to talk a little bit about greenhouses. And I got into gardening. I've done it a little bit most of my adult life. Well, that's not fair. I lived in an apartment until I was 40. And I bought my first house, and my mother thought I needed a flower bed. And then she thought I needed roses in the flower bed. And that's how I kind of got into it, and it grew from there. I have always wanted a greenhouse, but I didn't get one until I moved to Seguin. I've been in Seguin for 11 years. This coming 1st of April, that was April Fool's Day, I moved into my house. And I'm going, I sure do hope this is not a big mistake. But anyway, I immediately started doing landscaping and gardening and things like that, and I immediately started wanting a greenhouse. So I didn't know much about greenhouses, except that I had visited a few. So I took what is now called, used to be called specialist training, advanced training on greenhouses to learn a little bit. So I know a little bit about greenhouses. So feel free to ask me any questions, and if I don't know the answer, I will either make up something or we'll see if we can find out for you, okay? So, first question most people ask who like to dig in the dirt is, should I or shouldn't I have a greenhouse? And it's a question you really need to think about, because you don't want this empty building standing there that you spent a lot of time and money on. It's supposed to be productive. This is my favorite greenhouse in the entire world. How many of you have ever been to the greenhouse in London at Kew Gardens. Anybody? It is phenomenal. Of course, they have a staff of I don't know how many hundred people taking care of it too. But if you ever get a chance to go, you should go. They have a collection of plants from all over the world that they've collected for several hundred years, really. So it's a real opportunity to see it. But that's not what my greenhouse looks like. Okay.
My granddaughter lives there, so I'm just wondering,
Mine doesn't even look like that.
what is the name of the donut?
Now I'm going to show you a lot of pictures of different greenhouses.
She's wanting that question.
Oh, I'm sorry.
It's okay, that's
What was your question?
No, I was wondering where that is in the.
Oh, the Kew Gardens. It's outside of London, England. So if you have a chance to go to England, I've been three times, and then you need to make occasion to go. It's a little outside of the city. It's not right in the city, but it's not far. And it is well worth the time. Now,
Is that yours?
Frank promised me this remote would work, Frank,
Is that yours?
because the last time I was up here,
Is that yours?
mine looks like that. It doesn't have cactus in it, but it looks like that. I'm going to show you a bunch of pictures of different kinds of greenhouses so that you can get, there's a large range of stuff you can do. Okay, so questions to ask yourself. Put my glasses on so I might be able to see.
An answer?
Do I really want one? And if I do, how am I going to use it? Because there are a lot of things you can do with the greenhouse. And then the next question is, where am I going to put it? We're going to talk about all these things, so I'm not going to answer them right now. What type do I want? Am I going to build it myself or buy one that is a kit, or having somebody come in and build one for me? I was talking to somebody before class, and since I am an absolute and total klutz, you know the put together furniture that back when, yeah, I always have a screw left over. And I'm going, okay, which part of this do I have to take back apart to put it together right? And I read the instructions twice before I started. So building it myself, that's not going to happen. And if I'm going to build or buy, what kind of materials do I want to use? And we'll talk about the type of materials that are available, what kind of working parts, what kind of furniture, benches and things like that do I want in there. And now that I have it, what the heck am I going to do with it? So, there are pros and cons, as there are with most things. You're going to be investing time and money in a greenhouse, both initially and ongoing. And so you need to be conscious of that and willing to make an informed decision. So pros are, it can extend your growing season. You know how many of us got ready to have the plant sales? Because you have to get the seeds started and all this good stuff, and the seeds were starting in January, and it was a little chilly and stuff in January. I wish I could say it was chilly and wet, but and so it extends your growing season. It protects those seeds and seedlings, whether they're from seeds or from cuttings. And since in a couple of weeks we're going to be talking about germination and propagation, and I happen to do the cutting section, I don't want to ignore that. It protects from harsh weather, from insects, and from birds. You know those little birds that I feed so religiously? They speak to me if I don't feed them. Does anybody else feed birds?
Oh, yeah.
Do they harass you if you don't put the food out? Yes.
They want.
I mean, one morning I have a privacy fence along my back. I live in town, and it's a privacy fence. One morning I went out, and there were birds lined up on the fence by the bird feeder, sitting there, going, where are you? And why haven't you gotten out here? But they will also sometimes attack young growing things, and so that helps protect it from the birds. And you can save a fair amount of money on plants by buying seeds and taking cuttings and doing it yourself instead of going to the nursery. Although I have to say I help to support the local nurseries pretty well. Okay, the cons. You got to pay attention to the plants that are in the greenhouse because they need water. And of course the plants outside need water, and we haven't had much rain, so that's probably not a lot different than regular plants. You need to monitor the heating. Right now, spring is an interesting season. It's the kind of season that you can wear clothing from every season in one day. I mean, you get up in the morning and you dress for winter, and then midday you kind of take the layers off and you're dressing for spring. By evening you're dressing for summer. So it's kind of the same way in a greenhouse, you know. So you have to pay attention to it. The heating, you start off, if you turn the heater on last night, which I did in my greenhouse, but I went out this morning before I came here and turned it off because it's going to get into the mid to upper 80s today. And they would all melt, and things can overheat. Okay, now I've decided, thought about this, really want a greenhouse, okay? How much money am I willing to spend? How large must it be, or how much money do I have to make it how large? You know, that. But I do remember when I took the greenhouse specialist training, one of the instructors, and I've never forgotten this because it was so true, one of the instructors got up there and she said, however big you think you want your greenhouse, make it bigger. Do you know what I do with my greenhouse, particularly in the wintertime when I've shoved things in there to try and keep them to survive cold weather, is, boy, I wish this thing were bigger. I just wish, it needs to be bigger. So how big? How much growing, and part of that is dictated by how much growing space, but not just growing space in terms of seedlings and things. But if you use your greenhouse to overwinter, which a lot of us do, we have tropicals and we overwinter things in the greenhouse, then how much space do we need just to put things? And how automated, and we'll talk about different kinds of automation here in a little bit. Now, if you guys have questions, just ask. Now, sometimes I get wrapped up and you may have to jump up and down and yell at me to get my attention. That's okay. I'm not easily offended. I might cry, but I'm not easily offended. Okay, now then, how am I going to use it? I'm going to start plants from seeds. What are the major uses I make of mine? Or cuttings, propagation of any sort for that matter. Protect tropicals, another major use that I make of mine. Those are the two things that I primarily do with my greenhouse. Grow plants or crops out of season. Does anybody here grow tomatoes that are in pots in the wintertime? Okay, you can have, tomatoes are everybody's favorite fruit. I mean, that's, somebody said, I took tomato plants to the plant sale. Somebody said, how many tomato seeds did you grow? I said, 100 plus. Well, I mean, the packets have all these seeds in them. You can't just not plant it. You know, you have to put, and then you've got the plants. Fortunately, we have the plant sales. Since I have a very small garden, and although I work at a couple of projects where I can take some plants, there is a limit. So we're selling most of the stuff. April's doing great with the online sales too. You can grow plants or crops not adaptable to the locale. So if you're like me and you like tropicals, there are periods of time where our climate here is wonderful for tropicals. Winter's not one of them. And so my greenhouse in the wintertime is full of ferns and hibiscus and things that do fine the rest of the year outside, but will not really thrive or even survive. Oh, by the way, this is just an offer. It won't be available until Earth Day. It'll be a big sale Earth Day, downtown here in Seguin Park.
When is
That's the last Saturday in April, yes.
Last Saturday in April.
Yes, 27th, 6th or 27th, I can't remember for sure. And I am going to have a bunch of desert roses. If you don't know what a desert rose is, I'm going to have a bunch of desert roses. I started off a few years ago with 2 little desert roses plant. I bought it at Home Depot or someplace. And then they put some seeds out, so I planted some seeds, so I had some others, and I kept a couple and I shared with friends and neighbors. This year, the 2 mama plants decided we're going to have seed pods. Now, I don't know how many of you ever had a desert rose, but they are a warm weather plant. You have to overwinter them inside. They're really pretty. They're pretty carefree. They are potted plants because you have to move them. And the way they propagate, and I'm getting off topic here a little bit, but they put on seed pods that are about that long. And inside are these feathery seeds attached to this feathery thing. So when the seed pods open, they go flying all over the place. So you have to watch the seed pods. Anyway, lots and lots of seed pods, so I have lots and lots of baby desert roses that are going to the Earth Day sale.
Do they have to be taken care of like your tropicals and put into the greenhouse during the wintertime?
I'm sorry, my hearing.
Yes.
Do they have to be put in a greenhouse during the wintertime for protection?
Yeah. Okay. So, not adapted to locality. I knew I got off topic for a reason. And you can control the growth of plants some. Okay. Just different kinds of things growing. This is an orchid. This is not my orchids, by the way. This is a friend's orchids. It's beautiful, aren't they? Okay, greenhouse growing tomatoes, which you can do either in containers or hydroponically. Did any of you get a chance to go to Beth Smith's hydroponic gardening presentation? She did a lunch and learn a while ago. I'm sure, is she doing a presentation for the class?
She'll come in a few weeks, yeah.
Yeah. If you get a chance, it's not something I've gotten into, but a lot of people do, and they really like it because it gives you a lot of options, like growing tomatoes out of season. Here's somebody who just has stuff growing on the ground in the greenhouse.
So where's the space?
That's kind of my thing. This was interesting. Now, I haven't done this, but my sister did.
Are those gutters?
It is basically gutters that are connected by chains on the side, and then there are drip irrigation things that come down. Now, you can grow a lot of plants in a small space with something like this. The thing is with this, you have to have plants that have shallow root systems, because obviously you have about 4 inches of soil. But there are a lot of plants that don't take a lot of soil. Okay, now, where am I going to put it? I've decided I want one. I've decided I'm either going to build one or I'm going to buy a kit. I've made all those basic decisions. Where am I going to put it? Space is an issue, obviously. If you have land, excuse me, I'm going to grab my water here. I'm afraid that the spring is sprung thing in my sinuses are. You may not have as much of a decision to make on where to put it as some of us who live in town with landscaped yards and go, okay, where am I going to put it? I want it. Where am I going to put it? How much space do I need? Do you live in a neighborhood with deed restrictions on construction? Yeah. Or, in some cases, HOAs with restrictions on construction. Building permits are probably going to be needed depending on where you live. You're going to have to check. Utilities. Now, you need certain utilities. There are two things for sure that you need. You need water. Okay, now it doesn't have to be in the greenhouse necessarily, but you need water close enough to the greenhouse to be able to pull. What I do is I have an expando hose that I pull in and water, and that way I'm not taking up space with hose in the greenhouse. But you need water. You need electricity. Now, and battery operated won't cut it. You're going to want lighting in there. And you're going to want heating. Now, the heating can be, and we'll talk about heating systems later, something besides electrical, but you will need electricity. And then you have to consider your neighbors. They may be perfectly happy, particularly if you share plants with them. But having lights on in the middle of the night, now you can turn lights off at night, but I forget sometimes, and or you can put them on a timer. And then I had this person I was talking to one time who, she didn't have a greenhouse, but she was growing things with grow lights in her garage. And she had the garage door open one time with the grow lights on and all this good stuff. And a police car drove by. Guess what the police car did?
Stopped, came back.
And he drove back by and he pulled up at the curb, and she went out. She happened to be in the, she went out and she said, "You can come in and look if you want. I'm not growing weed." Now, you know how I feel about weed. I like weeds. Oh. I was having a, now some of you are too young to get this, but I was having a conversation the other day with somebody about weeds and stuff, and I said, you know, I was kind of like Bill Clinton, of the generation where I didn't inhale. I just, but I make no commitments about the brownies that I ate. So you do have to think about your neighbors. Okay, what types? So let's talk different kinds. There are a wide range of types of greenhouses. This is a basic Quonset hut. Basically what this is, a frame, and it doesn't even have a permanent covering on it. It just has heavy mill plastic, okay?
It doesn't work in Texas.
Yeah, well, it will work for a season or two, but you have two problems. One is the wind,
Yeah.
and the other is the sun.
Yeah.
Over time, that plastic will really deteriorate. Now, if you're just doing it for, okay, I don't want it for very long, I just want it for a couple growing seasons, you could probably get away with it. But you're right, it wouldn't. This is what's called gabled. Mine looks very much like this. Got a slanted roof, doors, and I'll talk building materials here in just a second. I've got some examples. This is, this is neat looking. Yeah. It's a Gothic arch. I wasn't going to spend that kind of money.
What's that cost?
I can hear my mother in my head sometimes. Any of you ever hear your mothers and fathers in your head? I can hear mine going, it's a little waste of money, isn't it? She'll work just as well with something else, less expensive. This one I have never actually seen. This is a geodesic globe.
Don't.
It doesn't have
I'm
much.
not sure how you would practically put plants and benches and stuff in there. Cool looking, but practicality, not sure about that. An A-frame? Now, a lean-to, somebody spent some money on this. A lean-to is basically any greenhouse or building for that matter, where you have a permanent structure and you build something on it with one wall of the permanent structure providing a wall for the greenhouse. And then you build 3 walls and a roof over the greenhouse. Now, the advantage, if you can do it, is it's a nice stable building to build up against. The disadvantage is in terms of light, because you only have 3 sides that light is coming into the greenhouse. A lot of lean-tos don't look quite that fancy. Okay. This is another one that's even fancier. Okay. And then some things that aren't quite greenhouses but can be used to grow things that are handy. Cold frames, screen houses, lathe houses, and shade houses. This is not a cold frame exactly. I'll do cold frames in a second. But this is just a window. I lived in a house one time that had a bay window, and I used it similar to this. Okay, this is a cold frame. Anybody here ever done cold frames? They work out well for you?
I use them in my
Cold frames are usually built into the ground. You basically dig a hole, and you build a cover to go over the hole that provides protection, and you open and close the cover. Okay? Then you put pots and stuff in the cold frame. They can be pretty simple, or they can be very elaborate. Okay, this is a shade house. This is a frame again with a cloth shade cover over it that you can take off and let the sun in. So you can provide shade when it's really hot and take it off in the spring and fall and have plants in there if you want. The advantage of a shade house is exactly what it sounds like. It provides shade in the heat of the summer. It can also provide protection from insects. And this is a shade house with the cover taken off. I'm trying to stay out of your way when I'm wondering. I could stand at the podium and talk, but that's not really my style, so. Okay. This is a lathe house, and basically all it does is provide some shade. Okay, and a screen house, which is basically a freestanding screened-in patio that you grow things in. It provides some shade. You could put shade cloth over the top if you wanted. And it provides protection from insects. Now, Texas grows things big, as I have been informed ever since I moved to Texas 11 years ago. Bigger, better, and everything, and that includes the mosquitoes. So this can be an advantage. Although I had a friend of mine who was from Alaska,
Yes.
And he swears the mosquitoes there are much bigger than they are in Texas.
They are. And
They are?
the bug spray.
That doesn't even faze them?
It's like you're feeding them.
They like the bug spray, do they? Okay, remind me not to move to Alaska. Now, I have been to Alaska. In fact, I'm going back again this August. And in the summer, it's beautiful. But you're right, the bugs are, I'm pretty sure I couldn't deal with the winter.
She said mosquitoes are the state bird of Alaska.
Really? Yes. Well, I understand that all the bugs in Alaska are grow fat. They have a very short growing season. So we make up for it by let's do this and do it right and grow really fast and really big. Okay. This is just because I really would like to have this. This is an atrium.
At the lottery, you can buy it.
I love it. Of course, I'm the kind of person, I bought a house when, I moved a fair amount in my life, but I bought a house one time, and after I bought it, the realtor said, she told me, she said, you're the only person I've ever known who bought a house because of the back porch. It had a 30 by 15 screened-in back porch. I just love that back porch. Okay. Now, other things to consider. You're going to have big. You're going to have medium. You're going to have small. Now, part of that's going to be dictated by your pocketbook, but part of it's going to be dictated by your property. Now, mine is an 8 by 12 because that's what I had space for. You know. Orientation, we'll talk about all this, shade, this sort of stuff. You want to build it so it's expandable. So, okay, this is this big now, but if I want it, I can make it bigger. And we probably won't talk much about commercial greenhouses. It depends on who I'm doing a presentation for. Okay, so size. Depends on what you're going to grow, how you're going to use it, basically. Excuse me, I'm sorry. How much you're willing to spend, your utility bills, if you have access to natural gas or not. Now, you can use gas, well, gas of any sort. I told you need the electricity for the lighting, if nothing else. But if you have access to gas, gas can be a less expensive option for heating than electricity. So you can use natural gas, you can do propane, or you can use electricity. Now, I live in an all-electric neighborhood, so gas was not an option for me unless I use a propane tank, a portable propane tank, which I could have done. Okay, then you want to consider light. We can talk about all this. What kind of heating and cooling system, if any? Water we've talked about. Salinity. Anybody live someplace where salinity is an issue with their water? I live here in Seguin, and it's not. The issue we have with water is calcium. We have very hard water. But there are places where this is an issue. If anybody's ever been to Salinas, Kansas, you know why they call it Salinas?
Because it's salt water.
Because there are a couple places that I used to travel for on business that I made sure I had bottled water. Normally, I'm fine with drinking tap water, you know. But there are a couple places where I'm going, okay, we're going to have bottled water because I can't drink the stuff that comes out of this tap because of salinity. What kind of growing media you're going to use? Carbon dioxide is not going to be a major issue for most of us if you keep the place properly ventilated. fertility, wind, humidity. We don't have humidity here, do we? No. And we don't have insects either. No. And disease control. And I understand that your presentation after I am done, assuming you can ever get me to shut up, is going to be on diseases. You're going to have Kim Cochran here talking about plant diseases. She is great. Have you guys done pests yet? No?
Yeah.
All right, that one's going to be good too. Okay. Build or buy. If you build, there are lots of options. Obviously, you can go buy all new materials and that sort of stuff, or you can use recycled. Or you can build it from a kit. It's called the Wimpy style, like I did. Okay, using recycled and purchased materials is one way, kit is another way. Now, I've seen some really neat greenhouses that are made with recycled materials. I saw one that basically they had taken used windows and made the walls out of the windows. And the advantage of that was the windows open and close. And you put a screen on them, and you have a natural ventilation system. Okay, so construction. If you're going to use wood, which I don't recommend, but if you are, make sure that you use a wood that is water resistant. Because that humidity that we were all laughing about just a minute ago that we don't have, guess what it does to wood? So you need redwood, assuming you could find it these days, cypress or cedar, or treated recycled lumber, something that is going to be resistant to damage from humidity. You can use galvanized steel, again with recycled PVC pipe or aluminum. Any of those will work. Just depends on what you can get easily. Like this is an aluminum frame. That's what mine happens to be, is aluminum frame. They're pretty resistant to rust. They last for a long time. They are lightweight, so if it's in an open area with high winds, you need, which we've been having a few of lately, you need to make sure it's well anchored because they will shift if you. This is a joint on a wood. Treat the joints with tar or something that will help resist the humidity. Or you can use galvanized steel joint. This is steel. Mine doesn't look like that, by the way. Okay, foundation. If you're going to go full bore, you can have a concrete pad poured. Now, two things going to do that. Make sure it is level land, okay? And make darn sure you have got appropriate drainage. The humidity issue again. You're going to have water in the greenhouse. I mean, that's what you're going to do, is have water in the greenhouse. And you need to make sure that water's not standing, because what's going to happen if you have standing water in our weather conditions? Well, you're going to have mold, that's one thing. You're going to have insects. Where do mosquitoes breed?
Standing water.
Right. So that's one thing. You can use gravel. You can use sand and fabric. That is, put a fabric cover down and then put sand on top of it. Or you could do it the other way around, for that matter. Put sand down and put fabric on top of it. Except the fabric will deteriorate over time, so that's an issue. or you use boardwalk. There's a lot. I'll show you some options here. Okay, this is one. This has got a concrete with a drain in it. This has just got fabric. I like this one. They put pavers down, and then they have gravel or pebble rock, which either is fine, on either side, so the drainage goes there. And you'll notice on the pavers, so that provides a nice steady walking space in there. But you'll notice on the pavers, there is no sealer between the pavers. You need to make sure it's open so the water can get through. This is a gravel. Now mine looks very similar to this, except mine's, well, it's pea gravel, the larger gravel.
That looks like wood.
Did you pack that down after you put it in? Did you? Okay.
Okay, covering. Get my props. What else do I have in here that I've forgotten about? This is something. I'm back. Props. Now, you could do glass. Glass is most attractive, but it's also the hardest to keep clean. It's also the most fragile, and it's also the most expensive. So typically, most of us hobbyists don't do glass. But if you're going to do glass, look for recycled. It's going to be a lot less expensive for you. Like the windows, for example. That's a good option using glass. Polyurethane film. Or where's the chippy? There are a number of polycarbs and fiberglasses that you can use. This is a thin sheet of fiberglass. Not my recommended because there's no insulation here to speak of, but it can work. These are polycarbs. I have several different. There's clear. Now, polycarbs are going to have an insulation. There's a cell here. So you've got two layers of plastic with an airspace. This provides insulation from the weather. You can get, now it has, the kit's not going to come with it, but you can special order where you've got two layers of air fiber. So you'd have 3 layers of polycarbs with 2 air pockets in between. That provides better insulation, but it's also going to be considerably more expensive. You can get clear, slightly shaded, or really shaded. Now, if you have things out, mine's clear, because I want the sun coming in when I'm growing the seedlings in the wintertime. But wherever you're using it, whatever is going to be appropriate for your weather conditions and wherever you're using it. Another option is this corrugated. Now, I don't recommend this for the walls, but this can be an option for the roof because the water will drain down it. Again, clear or shaded, depending on what you want to do in your greenhouse. Don't let me walk off and leave these, okay? It's your responsibility. Or you can use plain plastic sheeting, but as we talked about earlier with the plastic sheeting, not going to last well. and you're going to be doing repairs and mending a lot. Yeah. So this is polycarb.
Where do you buy that?
Well, kits will come with it, or you can buy or order it from places like Lowe's and Home Depot, or any building supply.
Yeah, Home Depot doesn't carry it
It doesn't? They use
on the thing, but you can get it online.
Yeah,
That's the only way you can get it.
yeah. So,
And it comes in at, I would assume, like a 4-foot by 8-foot sheet?
yeah,
Okay.
yeah. You'll need to have the tools to cut it to whatever size that you want. Now, if you buy a kit, what it's going to come, the kit's going to come with the frame built for appropriate for the sizing of the panels. Yes.
I was going to say, there's also that Farm Tech or the Grow Span Greenhouse.
Yeah.
company.
Yeah,
And then we
I
have
think
a
so.
place called Peak Plastics out of Dallas, that it's cheaper the more you buy. It goes down a little bit. So it's good to know.
Good information. This is the plastic sheeting thing. Again, it's not going to be very permanent. This is a lean-to with some polycarb on it. Most of the kits that you buy will have some version of polycarbonate. That's almost all of them. Now, there are professional greenhouse companies. There's one in San Antonio. I've never used it, but I have friends who have. If you want to invest that kind of money, where they will come and whatever building materials you want to use, they'll build it for you. It'll be professional construction people putting it together, and they'll put in water into the greenhouse, electricity, where I had to pay a separate electrician to come in and do it. It just depends on what you want, how you're going to use it, and how much money you're willing to spend. What I want and how much money I'm willing to spend don't always match, you know. Again, the plastic sheeting thing. Okay, design. Part of the design is going to be dictated by what you're going to grow. And part of it, the other things you have to think about is what kind of materials and stuff do you want in there in terms of benches? What kind of land do you have? What kind of head house, we'll talk potting areas, we'll talk about that. Storage and the issue of weather and winds where you live. And the difference between, how many of you live out with some land? Anybody? A lot of you. The difference between living in town and living out of town in terms of weather is pretty significant sometimes. This is a benching system. And we're going to look at different kinds of benches, but this is one that uses, oh, I just went out of my head, the kind of heavy-duty wire. Yeah, guys, help me. Yeah, thank you. It's another shot of the. This one didn't bother with benches. That makes my back hurt looking at it. Oh.
That looks like Green Gate.
Okay, other things to think about when you're building. Is your land flat, or do you have a slope? How much leveling are you going to have to do? You'd kind of like it as flat as possible. It's not always possible to get it perfectly level, but you would. If you're going to be hauling things in, how close are you to a street or roadway? Utilities, we've talked a little bit about that. We'll talk about some more. I just put this in because I thought it was a neat shot. I wish mine looked like that. Nice greenhouse with a, never mind. Okay, so location. And it's going to be dictated some by what you've got available, okay? But do you want full sun, part shade, and that's going to be dictated by when you're going to be growing things. in the winter, in the spring, and the summer. Although, you know, somebody told me shortly after I moved to Texas, they said, Texas has got 3 growing seasons. Summer is not one of them. Yeah. Or do you want shade in the summer and sun in the winter? Which is basically how I've tried to get mine.
Okay, do you put your shade screens out in June? Or do you put them out beforehand?
I'm sorry, what?
Your shade screens, you know, to keep the,
No,
No?
no. My greenhouse, and I'm going to talk about location here in just a second, my greenhouse is in the absolute worst location you could possibly do. It's on the north side of the house. It's under a 40-year-old crepe myrtle tree. Now, the good news about that is, in the winter time, when I'm using the greenhouse, the primary time I use the greenhouse is the you know, from fall to spring, about now. Mine's pretty empty right now. Things have been moved out. The crepe myrtle loses its leaves, so the sun comes in. Ideally, I would not have put it on the north side of the house, but that's where I had room, and it wasn't taking my rose beds out, so I could put it on the east or south side of the house. So, and the way my backyard is, the west side is the house. So, south or southeast is best, not north. You do what you got to do sometimes, and it's worked out pretty well for me. All-day sunlight is best, so that you're getting natural light in. You're going to have to use some artificial lights, particularly if you're doing seedlings, but as much natural sunlight as you can get, which is why I don't do shade cloth, is I want the sun in there when I'm growing things. If you're going to have shade, you want it in the late afternoon and evening when it's hottest, not in the morning. And you want to try and maximize winter sun exposure. Since that's the biggest time we use greenhouses around here, that's when you want sun on it. How many of you have ever done a sun inventory where you live? Anybody? Good. Basically that is, you know, you kind of know, well, you know, front of my house faces north, and actually mine faces west. So if you want to get something burned up, you plant it in the front. But you don't just go, okay, I know which direction is what relative to things, but where's the sun at various times of the day and at various times of the year. We just did what this last weekend? We just, lost or gained an hour depending on how you want to look at it. Actually, we didn't lose or gain anything, we just changed the clocks. But the days are getting longer, okay? And at different times of the year, the sun is doing different things. So it's not just different times of the day, it's different times of the year, and when will I be using the greenhouse? So that's what a sun inventory is, and it lets you not just with greenhouses, but with planting. When you're planting a permanent plant, you need to know what it needs and what your house structures or other structures are providing, or trees, or whatever it might be. Okay.
That's a view.
As we said, can be
That's a barn.
site limiting. Mine, that's a small little greenhouse. Okay. Cooling. There are a lot of different kinds of cooling systems. Depending again on how much money, how you use it, how much money you're willing to spend. And one is an evaporative cooler. There are roof vents, wet walls, air conditioners, exhaust fans, fan tubes, and fan and beds. We'll talk about all of them. Most of us are not going to be investing in, I will tell you that, as hobbyists. Okay. One thing you definitely need is you need roof vents. And all kits come with roof vents. If you pay somebody to come in and build it, they're going to put roof vents in. You can or cannot have a pulley system. That's nice. That's an advantage because you don't have to get on a stepladder and push the vents up and down and fasten them. But you have to have a roof vent. Why? What does heat do? Yeah. And it's just going to sit up there and bake everything. So you need a roof vent. Multiples. They usually come at least 2, depending on the size of the greenhouse. 1 on either side. The bigger the greenhouse, the more roof vents there will be. An evaporative cooler, sometimes known as a swamp cooler, is an option. Now, I've been tempted to try it, but I've talked to people who have used it, and they've been less, it cools all right, but it also puts moisture in the air, and therefore mold and things like that tend to grow.
Will go moldy.
So that's been your experience, don't? Yeah, so I haven't ever pursued it.
It's better to stick it in the window of your house than that, right?
That's the
Yeah.
last thing you want. In a house.
It seemed like a really good idea, but I think that if I bought it, it would have been, it was a good idea at the time that I bought it, because they're relatively inexpensive and they're portable and all that good stuff. But you might want to just think about it.
Greenhouse would be great.
Yeah, a fan and pad system is basically, you've got this pad of material with water running down it and a fan behind it blowing through and blowing cool air. Now this takes a pretty, it blows cool air into the greenhouse. And this takes a pretty big operation to justify that kind of okay, swamp cooler, another version of the evaporative cooler. A vent pad. Now, let me talk about vent. This is besides the roof vents, the other thing you need is a vent fan. And you don't have to spend a lot of money on it. They're not difficult to install. Now, I have to admit, I did not install mine. I got my brother-in-law. When I moved to Texas, I moved here, I didn't know anybody except my sister and brother-in-law. So I moved 3 blocks away from them so that my brother-in-law can come over and do stuff. I start my conversations off with him as, oh, favorite brother-in-law? He's my only brother-in-law too, but anyway, he came over and installed it. You can buy a little, depending on the size of your greenhouse. I mean, if you have a big greenhouse, you're going to need a bigger fan. For a smaller greenhouse, you can buy a little bathroom vent fan. It's not a big deal. You put it on the back wall of your greenhouse. Ideally, you have it set on a thermostat because you want it to come on when the heat gets up in the greenhouse automatically. You don't want to have to go out there and turn it on.
Okay.
You can buy a solar fan on Amazon for $31.
Those look, I lived in Rockport, and that's how we cooled our house with a vent fan. Just a about a fan about this big, mounted on the wall. And we'd open all the windows in the house about 1 inch, and
it pulls, that vent fan pulls that hot air out of there.
Good.
I grew up in an older house. When I say older, it was built in 1905. And it had an attic fan. Didn't have air conditioning. It had an attic fan. And that cooled a 2-story house. Of course, this was not here. This was in Southern California. But so anyway, this is a refrigeration. This is a fancy air conditioning unit. Now, if any of you build a greenhouse that justifies this kind of a unit, I want to come visit, let me know just as soon as it's done, okay?
Mac will take care of you.
This is another vent fan. This happens to be a little bigger than mine is. Mine's not very big, but then my greenhouse isn't very big. But if you have a bigger greenhouse, you want a bigger fan. Now, before I move on to this, in addition to those, one of the other things that I recommend is that you have a fan in the greenhouse to move the air around. Now, it can be a fan on a stand. Mine's a little table.
Oh, oscillating.
But yeah,
Okay.
fan. And it basically, what it keeps is keeps the air moving, and it reduces the chance of disease on your plants. It's not really a cooling system, although it helps with that. But because that you have an enclosed space and in humidity, things are going to just sit there. This keeps the air moving some. This one's just sitting on a shelf right inside the door, blows across the greenhouse. Circulating fan. Okay, heating systems. Keeping an eye on my time here. Of course, April's not jumping up and down, but April's not here, so. Okay, so as we talked earlier, several options for heating system. You will need heat. We don't have horrible winters here usually, although there was one year that we made exception to that. That's just for a week, but it was pretty much the week from hell. But natural gas, propane, wood, or other combustible, solar, and electric. Now, I may say a word before we move on to some of these about wood. It is an option. You can do it if you want a wood-burning stove in your greenhouse. I do not recommend it for several reasons. Primary one, safety. You know, yes, something could happen with the others, but the chances are less than they are with wood. The other is, I've never used one, but it's got to be a pain in the you-know-what to be go out there stoking that stove all the time. So if you have natural gas, you can hook up to your natural gas system. You can, and then I'll show you a picture here in just a second, have little propane heaters, portable propane, or hook into, if you have propane tanks on your property, hook into your propane.
What about an old kerosene heater?
I've never used or talked to anybody doing kerosene. I would think there'd be safety issues with that as well. Solar panels are an option, and electric, which is the simplest one for most of us. Yes, sir.
There's a passive option that you can use too, and that's by using rocks and concrete blocks, water jugs painted black. They absorb the heat and give it off during the winter, during the night with the mild winters we have here. I've done that, and it works. It wasn't in a greenhouse, it's just a little potting shed.
Well, but still,
But it worked.
the idea is the same.
Kept stuff
Yeah.
all winter long.
Just a matter if you, yeah. Okay.
Yeah, some give off some heat, but I like the smell of rocks better. Not that there's anything wrong with manure, I want that too.
All righty. So let's talk a little bit about this.
Is that yours?
Now, this is the picture I showed you earlier, and we were talking about the flooring. Now I want to talk about the heating. This is a propane heater. Easy to install and maintain. And again, you can probably put that one on a thermostat and come on and off as needed. This is an electric heater and exhaust fan together. Some of these are way more elaborate than most of us are going to indulge in. But I wanted to show you the options. Okay, let's see here. Oh, sorry. Okay, shading. Now, whether you think you need additional shading or not is going to be up to you. But there are some things you can do. It depends on how much you want what you're going to grow. So, you can get shade cloth. And this one happens to have an automatic pulley system where it installs it. Somebody's not standing out there throwing that shade cloth over that greenhouse. Okay? But you can get shade cloth that you can take on and off, depending on how hot it is and what you've got in the greenhouse and how much shade you think you need. This is kind of a lathe house thing that has shade cloth over the lathes. Now, one of the things that was mentioned in there was paint, which I kind of skipped over because I highly do not recommend it here in this climate. What's going to happen to paint in our climate? On a roof of a greenhouse, out in the sun.
Don't say how long.
Do I see peeling paint in my future? This is on a plastic covering probably. You know, so it's not absorbing the paint, it's just sitting there. Okay, air circulation. And that's where my little fan, I kind of got ahead of myself, my little I use for it. It's important. So, shelving, benches, workspace, plant space. Again, you can be as elaborate or as simple as you want on this. So we're going to talk about accessories. I still have a few minutes. Okay, benches, lots of options. You can do wood, you can do hardware cloth, you can do welded wire, you can do fixed, you can do rolling. Mine are very elaborate. I found these shelves at Costco that they kind of put together so you can put however many of them together that you want. They have holes in them. Why are the holes in them important? Anybody? Water. You're going to be watering those plants? It's nice if the water doesn't sit on the shelves. It just goes through them. So, these are nice wood ones, but it has a hard surface here. Now, it has a wire surface down here, but it has a hard surface here. That's an issue because, again, the water's sitting on the shelves.
But wouldn't it be a good work area?
That's probably what it was.
I'm sorry, hon, what?
Would it be a good work area, that hard space to work? And then,
You could.
That's probably what
Okay.
it was. That's probably what it was.
These are wood and wire again. That's really a nice option because but if you're using wood, again, I want to caution you to use treated wood, that the water will mitigate, at least mitigate damage that the humidity and the water are going to cause to the wood, because they will. I said, move. Okay. So, we've talked about most of that. You can, if you have space, I don't. Mine are against the wall and around the back and stuff. But if you have space, you can do the peninsula thing. I like that idea if mine was wider, because you can work both sides. Or rolling. Now, if you're going to have rolling benches, you're going to need that concrete floor, because I can just see you trying to roll a bench on gravel. That's going to work really well. If you're going to do it, let me know. I'm coming with the camera. Okay? But one of the things you do need to think about when you're planning your greenhouse is, how do I want to arrange the furniture in it? See, this is my dream greenhouse. And it's got all the little fans up there to circulate. And nice. Again, straight wood, treated wood, with holes where the water doesn't sit on the wood. Concrete block and wire. Inexpensive, easy. And we're back to our, okay. This remote and I.
You gotta break that remote.
Lighting, you will need supplemental lighting. Now, you can buy, and most people do, greenhouse lights. There's special lights you can raise and lower on, usually on chains, to get them close to seeds when they're starting and move them up as the plants grow and that sort of stuff. You want to make sure the light bulbs in there are grow lights, the special UV provisions. Or you can be cheap like me. I've got, I probably shouldn't even say this, everybody's going to go, she just lost all credibility with me. You know the utility lights with the aluminum hoods?
Yes.
With clamps? That clamp on the sides, the supports on the greenhouse, one on either side, raise and lower on the supports. Worked well for, I've had that greenhouse for 8 years now. It worked pretty well. So creativity, sometimes just think about what will work.
You have some kind of grow light bulb in there, or 100 watt, or what?
Yeah.
Okay, what kind of bulbs do you have in there?
I have grow light bulbs. Now I had to go online. I mean, if you go down to H-E-B or Home Depot, they're not going to have grow light bulbs, but they're just light bulbs, but they are grow light bulbs.
Can I throw something out real quick? I'm waiting on an order from American Science and Surplus. It's a 12-foot long string grow lights. They're cheap.
Yeah.
American Science and Surplus.
Yeah, you put a fluorescent holder in with the long grow lights. That's ideal. That's the ideal thing because you have nice even. Mine's not ideal. Mine was, I want something right now, and I didn't want to fuss with it, and I just never changed it. Okay, other things to be thinking about. You will need electricity. And you do not want to run a heavy-duty extension cord, okay? For several reasons, safety being the primary one. So that means you're going to have to, unless you're a licensed electrician yourself, you're going to have to invest in having an electrician come in and put electricity to your greenhouse. Now, how cheap or expensive that's going to be is going to depend entirely on how far your greenhouse is from the source of electricity. I'm fortunate, mine's about 15 feet. But it's something you will need. Hose bibs, not necessarily in the greenhouse, but close enough. You need a water source close enough that you can get a hose into the greenhouse. You're not doing commercial, so you don't need carts and cart access. Storage doesn't have to be in the greenhouse, but if you have space, it's nice if you have a storage area in the greenhouse. Mine is on my potting bench. I have an external potting bench. I have a shed that I had a potting bench built onto that's got shelving and cabinets and stuff on it. That's where my pot storage is, and my potting mix storage and all that good stuff. Chemicals and fertilizer, same deal. If you want to, you can get into water recycling and rainwater harvesting and that sort of stuff. it's a good thing to do if you have a building that's suitable for it. This happens to be an outdoor potting area. Let me go back. This is a nice one with water and everything. Let me go back, I missed one here. This is more what mine looks like.
Kind of dirty, huh?
Yeah. And this is a building that has rain barrels attached to it. Okay, maintenance. Now I'm going to really hit you on this one. This is important. If you want your greenhouse to last, it's important that you do good maintenance on it. Clean up after you spill something. If you pull dead leaves off or have infected plants, I think, is Kim here yet? Hi Kim. If you have disease-infected plants, take them out of the greenhouse. Clean up. Maintain a clean work environment. Cleanliness may not be next to godliness, but comes really, really close when it comes to having healthy plants. Check regularly for pests and diseases. And make sure you use clean tools. Now, here's the one that a lot of people don't pay good attention to, and that's annual, or in some cases, depending on how you're using it, semi-annual cleaning. Take everything out of the greenhouse, and you will spray the walls of the greenhouse using a pump sprayer or my handy-dandy little electric sprayer with a Clorox water solution, 10% Clorox solution. Ceiling, walls, roof, and then immediately hose it off because it will deteriorate the plastic. I do the interior and the exterior, but definitely the interior. Why would I want to, why?
Kill off any bugs or disease.
Yeah, insects, diseases, molds, you want it clean when you start your next growing season. I do this in the spring. Usually I'm through using the greenhouse by May. It starts getting hot. I've got everything that tropical pulled out. I've got all my seedlings are big enough to be doing whatever seedlings need, whether they're flowers or veggies or whatever. And so sometime in May or early June, I do this. I do a modified version of it usually in the fall before I start pulling stuff back in. Because stuff, even though you cleaned it, stuff will accumulate, like spider webs, for example. They love greenhouses. It will accumulate over the summer. So, clean everything. The benches, everything. Okay, now, I hope I've answered your question of should I or shouldn't I? And you don't even have to be a tragic figure like Hamlet. Any questions? Listen.
Do you do anything with it in the summer?
I'm sorry, my hearing.
Do you do anything with it in the summertime?
Not really, I don't. I know some people who do, but I don't. Mine basically sits empty in the summer.
Okay.
Most of the things that I like to do that require a greenhouse are going to be spring, fall, and winter things. Yes, ma'am.
What other options besides Clorox do you put on there?
What other options for what?
What are the options besides Clorox can you put in there?
Well, any strong cleaning, if you don't want to use Clorox, you could use Lysol or something like that. But you need a cleaning solution that is going to kill disease. Okay? That's the purpose of doing it. Is despite all the care you may take when you've got things in the greenhouse, you're going to have mold growing on the supports because you have so much moisture in there. And you want to get all that out of there so it doesn't just sit there and accumulate over the summer in our heat and humidity. So it's important. You want healthy plants, then you have to take care of your growing environment. I'm sorry about the hearing thing, guys. I have a condition called Meniere's. I don't know if any of you are familiar with it. And although I wear hearing aids in certain environments, I still have a problem. Yasa.
If you do go and buy a pre-built one or one that will be built in your backyard, and if it's okay with all your HOAs and everything else like that, and I don't know if you mentioned it because we were out having a meeting, but I would suggest that if you make that kind of an investment, then you find out if it's going to be covered under your homeowner's policy in case of major storms or anything of that nature.
Good point. Okay, other questions? Guys, it's been a pleasure. For those of you who don't have greenhouses, think about it. I hope I've helped answer some questions. For those of you who do, I suggest you get up here and teach class. Okay? Thank you.
We're open for 2.5 or 3 hours, 4 days a week. I think the high point for me was a time we could take care of 85 families in 3 hours. Yeah, now that's not typical, but we had a few weeks there where it was running really, really heavy in the winter time. But we take care of help people, a lot of people in our communities and Guadalupe County. So we want to provide the food. They are free to go out and pick. So that's what we do. How did my parrot heads end up in the POC?
You sent it to me, ma'am, and I shared it with April to be uploaded.
Yes. This is the garden. This is one of my other organizations. Those of you who are Jimmy Butler fans.
I'm sorry.
All right, guys, if you're interested, contact me. You've got my contact information. I'm going to be looking for a couple more volunteers. Now, go on, Brandon. Okay.
Thanks for having me. So, as he mentioned, I'm in Uvalde, Texas, but I cover all of Southwest Texas. So 30 odd counties plus a few little stray counties that don't have a plant pathology specialist in the coastal bend. So I cover a pretty large geographic area that has a lot of ecological diversity, from more true desert over to here and past here to the east over to Bastrop County and up north to Austin. So what else? I've been here since 2015, so I've been doing it just a minute. You know, this year will be 10 years, I guess. That kind of snuck up on me, but I guess it has been that long. I went to University of Arkansas for grad school, and I got my master's and my PhD, yes, Pig C, I know. I'm actually from there. I'm from Fayetteville, Arkansas, so if you hear a little accent, yeah, if you hear accent, don't judge me. All right, so we're going to talk about plant diseases and some of the basic concepts about plant pathology today. It'll feel a little bit like you're drinking from a fire hydrant, but just stick with it. It'll kind of click as we go along and hopefully gel for you at the end. I like to give you a really broad scope of the material so that you can be better prepared to continue your self-education later once you're a master gardener. I don't think it's me. All right, so first we will talk about plant health and plant diseases and what those are. Then we'll look at plant disease symptoms and signs and some examples of those. We'll look at specific groups of plant pathogens and disease examples. Then we'll look at disease diagnostics and exercises, disease management, and then some resources and other information. Now, along the way, I will be planting little seeds about disease management methods, and then we'll cover them in summary at the end. All right, so what is plant health? There's a lot of different definitions, and it's kind of a trendy term in agriculture right now. And generally, though, it can be defined as when a plant is free of disease, stress, or injury and can reach its full potential. Now, how we measure that full potential is completely within the eye of the beholder. So, when we're looking at it through a human lens, that's going to be how many pounds of tomatoes per plant, or how many bushels of corn per acre. In the natural world, it all boils down to how many successful offspring, no matter how that's achieved, whether it's through seeds, through self-propagation, things like that. So keep in mind that the way that we view plant health is not always the way that nature views plant health. So why is plant health important? And this slide's going to sound a little bit like plant pathologists tooting our own horn, but I've tried to keep it a little humble for everyone. Focusing on maximizing our plant health helps us maintain the security and stability of our food supply, and also it helps maintain the profitability of crop production. So why do we care about security and stability of food supply? That's a pretty obvious answer. We don't like famine. There are a lot of social upheavals that happen when you have significant food shortages. Here in the US, we've not really experienced that in the same way that humans have historically, or still do in other countries. So I feel like sometimes it's easy for us to forget that and get a little disconnected from it. But historically, with human civilizations, a lot of times if you have some massive repeated disease events like epidemics in plants, like in the crops, then you will often have social upheaval and political upheaval. And in some cases even, it can contribute to really significant change. Like it's thought that wheat rust was a contributing factor to the Roman Empire declining because there were repeated epidemics of excessively severe wheat rust and people were going hungry. And hungry people are very unsettled and very dissatisfied. I mean, there are a lot of other factors like political pressures and pressures from other societies and things like that, but it was thought to be a contributing factor. Now, let's think a little bit, we've talked about stability and availability of food, but what about food safety? So even in times when we have food available, plant pathogens can make them unsafe to consume for people. Now, most of the time that is not the case. I hate to tell you this, but you've already eaten a lot of plant pathogens in your life, and you're fine. But there are a few fungal pathogens in particular that make mycotoxins, and those can make people very sick or even die, not just people, but other animals as well. So, like smut, it's a fungus that infects grains, like cereal grains. Ergot, it causes ergot, it's not smut, it's ergot, and that causes ergotism when you consume it because the fungus itself is being consumed and it makes a toxin that then literally poisons your body. And you'll have things like hallucinations, delusions, lack of circulation to the extent that your fingers will actually become gangrenous and fall off, and the same with your toes. So it can be really severe and life-threatening in some cases. The good news is we have a lot of checks and systems in place for that to avoid that issue nowadays, so we have a very safe food supply. I would dare say that humans have never had a safer food supply in regard to like mycotoxins than we do now. Because 100 years ago we couldn't test for it and people would just, or animals like livestock would just mysteriously become sick. And now we don't have that problem because like in corn, for example, with a toxin called fumonisin, we have tests that every single seed lot that comes from the field goes through, and there's thresholds that are very low, like a couple parts per billion are the threshold. If it has more than that, the whole lot is rejected and it has to be disposed of or used for fuel. So it's a very different ballgame nowadays than even 50 or 100 years ago. So plant pathologists are kind of a big deal, just a little bit. We also look at profitability of crop production. And we look at direct costs of disease management, like fungicides, fuel, things like that. We also look at yield loss, or the impacts of plant pathogens, both in quantity and quality. So quantity is pretty obvious, we're reducing the volume produced, but quality is a really big factor as well. So let's say with vegetables. We have good quality leafy spinach produced in field A. Same farmer has field B. And it has, let's say, 5% rate of leaf spots. Well, no one wants to go get their baby leaf spinach, a little pre-washed bag at H-E-B or Walmart, and see leaf spots in it. That's kind of icky. So there's a very low threshold of acceptance for imperfection on our vegetable crops. So that whole field that has what's considered too high of a rate of imperfection would then be made into cooked spinach or spinach powders for like protein shakes or whatever, or animal feed. So, that producer will get a lower price for that than fresh baby leaf though, because that's a premium price, because it's really hard to make a really pretty spinach, basically, or other leafy vegetable. So does that make sense?
Yes.
Yeah. Cool. I know being second in the day, you're kind of, probably getting a little weary of material and sitting.
Not at all.
Oh, also,
Vacuum and suck it all up.
good. That's what I like. I like the vacuum classes, the little
Fire hoses.
sponge classes. All right, so I do take an opportunity on this slide to kind of clear up some misconceptions that I encounter a lot, probably less so in this group, but certainly among the general public, and that's corporate-owned farms. There's a lot of assumption made about corporate America owns all of our farmland. But in my experience, both here and in Arkansas and other states I've visited, that's not really been my observation. Every single farm that grows row crops or vegetables that I've been on is a family farm. Now that family farm might be 3,000 acres or 5,000 acres and span 2 different counties, but it's still a family farm. It's owned by the same family, like the Ritchie family. They own T. Rowe Trace Farms. Their family has owned that land not just owned, but grown spinach for like 130 years or so. And, they're huge. They spread from Uvalde County down to Zavala County, and they used to go all the way to the border with Mexico. And then the river changed, and they lost several hundred acres about 80 years ago. But that's an example of a really large family farm, but it's still a family farm. And, it's like every generation has taken it over. I think a lot of the misconception about corporate farming comes from like with corn and wheat, where you drive by the highway and you see these signs out on the edge of the road that say like DuPont or Pioneer or Bayer or whatever. And those are not ownership signs, but rather they're marker signs for variety trials or product trials actually. So it would be like Pioneer 5510, corn variety is right here, and competitors right there. Look how beautiful Pioneer or whomever. It's a direct comparison grow-out trial. And I think a lot of people see those and they think, oh, that whole farm's owned by Pioneer. But that's not the case. Now, we're not going to touch on seed rights and seed patents and things like that. That is a whole different, more advanced class. But the people actually growing, like in the ground, crops, all of them I've worked with are family farms. So hopefully that provides a little clarity for you guys. Because I understand if you don't necessarily get to have all the FaceTime with farmers and all the hours of driving around through middle of nowhere fields like I do. So most people don't. But I spend a lot of time alone or with farmers. So yeah, I know. Well, it recently occurred to me when I was doing like a youth field, or not a field day, like a science day, and they were asking me what a day in my job was like, and I was like, well, I go to my lab and I do stuff in the microscope, which is cool, and then I get in my car, and if I have like a client call, I'll go meet a farmer in a field in the middle of nowhere. So it's like I'm meeting strange men in the middle of nowhere, some of which I've never met before. So yeah, so I kind of filter that for the kids because I don't want to encourage that lifestyle. But yeah, I just kind of keep that away from my mom. I don't mention that part. I'm like, yeah, I'm taking my dog with me every time, sure. All right, so what exactly is a plant disease? It's a disruption of a plant that interferes with the normal structure, function leading to development of symptoms. Now, conversationally, people use plant disease to include everything on this slide. The stuff on the blue side is non-living causes. The stuff on the yellow side is living cause, or abiotic and biotic. Now, when you're talking to a plant pathologist, we're meaning the stuff just in that green circle, like things caused by pathogens. I would consider the things on the blue side to be disorders and injuries, and the things in the green circle are obviously the pathogens, and then we have injury caused by living things on insects, mites, and other herbivores. So what plant parts can be affected? Unfortunately, all of them. Sometimes by the same pathogen, sometimes by other, like different pathogens. But generally, we group pathogens into soil-borne and foliar pathogens. This is primarily based on where the pathogen lives throughout its life cycle, but also where the initial infection occurs. Types of pathogens we will talk about today include fungi, bacteria, viruses, and nematodes. Here we go, okay. With fungi being the biggest group and the most often we see. So now that we've talked about what causes disease, what is required for disease to occur? Because we have pathogens everywhere, we have plants everywhere, why don't we have disease, all the time, everywhere? Well, that is because we actually have to have a third component present to cause disease. So it has to all be present and happening in the same place at the same time. So that makes it less likely to occur. Now we have what is called the disease triangle. This is just a visual of the three components required for a disease event. That's a susceptible plant host, a pathogen that can infect that particular plant host, because not all pathogens infect all plants, thankfully. And then we need a favorable environment for that pathogen to carry out its life cycle, because otherwise it's just going to be kind of sitting there either dormant or semi-dormant, or in a different phase of its life, like a non-pathogenic phase. Now, a lot of newer materials will include a fourth point and make this a pyramid, and that is time. So the thing with pathogens is they're living things. So they need time to interact with that plant host and start causing disease. Just like with, say, a viral infection, like if you get a cold, it's not like, oh, I got the cold virus in my nose, I'm immediately sick. That virus needs time to interact with your body, replicate, and then start causing symptoms. So you'll start getting sick in a few days, and then you'll get worse and worse until you get better, right? So it's kind of the same thing. Now, think on this for a second and let it marinate in there. How could we prevent a disease from happening or manage a disease issue that is happening? We would mess with this disease triangle. So we can mess with the environment, change to a different plant host, or take action against the pathogen in some way. So in your handout along the way, there's little boxes like this that are just little kind of bonus note boxes, and also some vocabulary terms just to help you so you're not having to scribble things as fast. All right, so now that we've talked about what is needed for a disease event, what happens with a disease event? Now, this is very generalized. This is incredibly varied from pathogen to pathogen. But in a nutshell, we have an overwintering or resting or dormant state. There we go, up at the top. And this can happen in a plant, in an insect vector in some cases. It can happen in dead plant debris or even in the soil, depending on the pathogen we're talking about. So where this happens is very variable on what pathogen is in play, okay? Now, I don't like the term overwintering because it implies that always happens in the winter, which is not the case for us. It might be the case in like Minnesota and Canada, but not for us. So I prefer the term overseasoning or dormancy, because I encounter a lot of pathogens in our cool season veggies that are dormant in the summer because it's too hot for them to really be doing their thing at that time. So just keep in mind, for us, it's a little different schedule, so it's more about overseasoning. You're not protected from disease in the wintertime because we don't have a proper winter, right? Not like the rest of the country. Now let's say a plant host is planted there where that pathogen happens to be, and favorable conditions happen. So let's say hypothetically high humidity and nice 80-degree temperatures, hypothetically. Then the infection process starts, and that is where the pathogen gains entry into the plant and overcomes plant defenses. So plants aren't just like little sitting ducks. They actually have kind of it's not an immune system, but it's kind of like an immune system. It's plant resistance. So basically the plant has a lot of chemicals that they can make and actions they can take, like killing off a leaf and dropping it off to try to drop off the pathogen, right? But they also have a lot of chemicals that they can make in response to the pathogen. But the pathogen is always trying to essentially sneak by the plant defenses so that the plant doesn't know it's there until it's too late. And then it can't secrete those chemicals to kill off or inhibit the pathogen. So it's kind of like a little miniature chemical warfare inside the plant that's going on, or attempted, and the pathogen is always trying to sneak by. So let's say that pathogen was successful, and it is able to start colonizing the plant tissue. At that point, this is when we're going to have more time elapse, because it's colonizing and interacting with the plant. But that's when the pathogen will start causing disease symptoms, and this is when you'll notice it. So things like yellowing or tissue death. Then the pathogen will reproduce and spread, and in some cases that will go right back into dormancy, but in many cases, especially with our garden crops, we have what's called a secondary disease cycle. And rather than going back into dormancy, I can't see my mouse, there we go, it will actually go right back into finding a new plant host and starting that cycle over again. Now, I also don't like the term secondary because that's a little confusing. That, to me, implies there's only two, but that is not the case. It can happen over and over and over as long as there's enough plant available and enough, or adequately favorable conditions for the, pathogen. So, does that make sense?
Yeah.
Good? Okay. All right, some disease symptoms and signs. I promise we're about to get into the juicy part. It's going to be more and more pictures and less text. So, all right, symptoms are changes in response to the pathogen. So the plant is actually changing in some way. That includes wilting, yellowing, tissue death, stunting, and galls. Sign is direct evidence of the pathogen, like actual pathogen tissue, like fungal tissue or bacterial ooze in some cases. So here's a corner of a cabbage leaf. This was probably from 2018, if I had to guess. And you have yellowing, you have tissue death. You can see there's some kind of wilty appearance there. And if you look closer, this is, I'm trying to do this backward, there we go. This is that section just made bigger. You can see some white and then some little black dots. So that's fungal tissue. The black dots are fungal reproductive structures, and I took this with my cell phone, so I didn't need a microscope to see it. That is not the case with all pathogens. This one's just particularly showy and good for examples. So we have both signs and symptoms in this particular photo. And there's also going to be like little arrows and stuff just to kind of be a reminder about what we talked about on that slide. All right, so some common symptoms that I'm sure you've seen include leaf spots. These include yellowing and dead spots, also leaf blights. The spots and blights usually are caused by fungi, bacteria, and viruses in that order of commonality. And compare that to something like a more general, across the whole plant yellowing, could be something like nematodes or root rot, and it's more generalized across the whole plant as opposed to discrete spots. So on the top we have a tomato leaf with leaf spots. On the bottom we have a soybean leaf. No, that's a peanut leaf. Yeah, peanut leaf with leaf spots. And these are actually caused by the same pathogen. And notice that we do have that yellowing, we have tissue death. And then on this bottom one right here, can you see those little rings? So those rings are actually essentially tracking the fungal growth every day. So the dark band is actually covered in dark colored spores that are made during the day. The pale band is where the fungus grew and did not make spores overnight. So this particular fungus needs UV light to sporulate or reproduce at peak efficiency, which is why we have that day-night cycle on the growth pattern, like on the growth rings. So why do we care about that little seemingly trivial bit of biology about the pathogen? Well, buckle up, because we're going to learn some stuff. So knowing that about that pathogen, that it needs UV light to sporulate at peak productivity, we can then take that information to, say, your tomatoes or a small scale, say farmer's market scale tomato producer, and we can use UV blocking clear film, because plants don't require UV to photosynthesize, right? So we can use UV blocking film, put it over our little hoop house or over our plants in some other fashion, and you will have about 60% reduction of spore production, which is huge. That will make it a lot easier to get that problem under control. So when you pair that with some fungicides, you're going to have much better control than if you just sprayed some fungicides and hoped for the best. So understanding the biology of some of these pathogens will help us better understand and know what to do to prevent and stop problems. Yes? Okay. Oh, I always forget. So this is, I want you guys to look at the bottom picture, the bottom your right, versus the other two. Notice how those look very different. Two of them have spots, and then that third one has a more unique pattern. So we have chlorosis or yellowing along the veins that progresses to tissue death. Now this is oak wilt, and the thing with this is if you call me and you're like, hey Kim, I have a problem, the leaves on my plant are turning yellow and dying, what should I do? How helpful is that to me? Not at all. It's gold stars for reaching out, but I need more. So that's why I really like to get pictures so that I can see exactly what you're talking about, because if you go to grad school, you're going to have the jargon to describe these in more detail. You know, beyond saying, well, it has leaf spots. Well, what type of spots? How big are spots? You know, but if you send me a picture, I can say, oh, well, you know, that's alternaria on tomato, and this is what you should do. Or, oh, that's oak wilt. Take these steps. So photos are really, really helpful. And when you guys are master gardeners and helping people out, people are going to ask you questions like this. And it's really important as point of contact to know what type of information to gather to forward on to county agents or a specialist.
I have a question. So
yes.
If we find, let's say I'm a small-time farmer and I find an issue, who do I contact, you or the extension agent?
Either. Well, if it's beyond their scope, they get in touch with me. So the way that our agency works is we have extension agents in all counties, right? And they're like our feet on the ground. And then you have specialists, and there's usually one subject matter specialist for a whole region, or in some cases, the whole state. Yeah, so like we have a wildlife predator specialist for the whole state. You know, but like plant pathologists, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 7 of us for the whole state. So, and we all kind of have our own little subspecialty, but we do handle other problems too. But like if I have a virus issue that I don't have the test kits for, I'll forward that to my colleague in Weslaco because he has the virus hub clinic, basically. Versus if there's a sesame problem, they send it to me because I'm the sesame lady. Make sense? So basically you can contact anybody and you'll get to the right place eventually. But I have a list of regular clients that do just contact me directly though, if they're kind of frequent flyers in the lab. So, yeah. All right, so some other common symptoms include canker and dieback. These are often fungal or bacterial in nature. Most often they're going to be fungal, but I do occasionally see some bacterial issues. These will typically be on your woody plants, and I see this a whole lot on woody ornamentals, like roses in particular, not to hate on roses, but I see this a lot on roses. And it's exactly what it sounds like. It dies back the branch or the cane. And on this photo, right, where's my mouse? There we go, right here. You can actually see some fungal sign up here at the top, that white fluff. That's fungal sign. So it has, this fungus has invaded the stem and killed it. It's interacted with the host and it's secreted chemicals into it that's killed off the tissue, and it's actually taking nutrients from that dead tissue. So whenever we talk about, oh, let's prune out disease, right, which is a sanitation method, we're cleaning it up and removing the dead stuff. Would you want to, there's too much glare, there we go. Would you want to cut it right there? No. Correct. You want to go way down here. I like to say 4 inches minimum, but I admittedly err on the side of caution. I'm more risk avoidant with that. I want to go scorched earth on it and just get rid of it completely. So the reason we need to go much lower than it looks like is we know the pathogen is here, right? It's interacted with the host and killed it. But what about this transition zone where it's yellow? It's already had some time to interact with the host and cause that yellowing. But we actually have fungal tissue. There's so much glare I can't see. Where's my mouse? There we go. We have fungal tissue probably extending all the way down here. That's just not had time to interact with the host and cause that visible symptom yet. So that's why we need to go much further down than what it looks like. It's kind of like an iceberg. You only see part of what's there.
Don't take the foot, you take the leg.
Right.
But you would still want to find out what even caused it, because it's still in the ecosystem, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, usually you're not going to have just one branch that's affected. Like even in this photo on the right, if you look back there, that's got it too. It's probably like, yeah, I mean, it's in multiple places. So what I would do is prune that out and apply fungicide to get what you might have missed. Question over here?
I'm really new at this. I mean, this is really, I mean, you guys are know a lot more than I do. When you get that particular thing, where it's all dark and there's a little bit of yellow there, you just cut it off?
I would cut it off well below the yellow and then also apply fungicide, just to be sure that it's getting adequate treatment. I would do both, yeah. So I'm a big fan of stacking multiple management techniques together to ensure a higher chance of success. So I don't ever like to do let's do one thing and hope it works. I like to do 2 or 3 things so that I'm much more likely to be successful. All right, so here's an example of a dieback on a tree twig, and you can see it's dyed all the way back into the branch. And this is a good look at what a canker looks like on a branch when it's not completely going around it. That's called girdling, when it goes all the way around, like a girdle on a person goes around their whole torso. But this looks kind of more like a pancake just laid across the top of the branch. So cankers can look like that too. And on your right, that's a perennial canker, and notice it has kind of those rings again. And those are rings of progression of the pathogen. And some trees, you'll see cankers that will progress over many, many years, and that's why we have those perennial cankers that get bigger with time. Now sometimes, especially where we're at, I see seasonal advancement. So I'll see kind of more progression of a canker like that in the spring when we have these nice moderate temperatures. And then not much change in the summer when it's super hot, because the fungus isn't as happy during that time. And then I see another progression in the fall when our temperatures are more acceptable to the fungus again. So we live in kind of this weird little area where we get unusual seasonality with pathogen activity. All right, so galls are abnormal enlarged growths of the host tissue in response to infection by the pathogen. And these are actual host, like tissue or cells, which is very different than like gall wasps. Gall wasps are not pathogenic. They're ugly, but they don't actually hurt anything. But true galling from a plant pathogen is disrupting usually the vascular system, and it's also parasitizing the host and taking nutrients from it. So gall wasps don't do that. They're a whole different thing.
But they do that, the wasps. I've always heard wasps.
Yeah, the gall wasps?
Yeah.
Yeah, like in the photo right here where you have like little balls on the leaves. Now there are some other galling insects that do more damage to the plant, but it's, how can I explain this? It's going to be a little different than pathogenic galls. Like, I'm going to start including another photo here for more examples. But talk to me like after class and give me your email, and I'll email you some more pictures. So that way, because when you see it, you'll be able to see the difference. All right, so galls, like on the right, yeah, right. That's actually some galling caused by agrobacterium. And in the case of pathogenic galls, the pathogen gets in the plant and it manipulates the growth regulation in some way. and that can be through chemicals it makes, like growth hormones, salivary products from like nematodes, or not nematodes, some insects can do that with their salivary products, but those are interacting with the host differently. That's a really good question. I need to have another slide here because I'm not explaining it as well as I want. But anyway, so here's the agrobacterium, and each blob here that you're seeing, I forget y'all aren't seeing my thing, each little circle here, blob is not the technical term, but each little circle here, that's an accumulation of overgrown cells. So cells will grow way too big. It's very much like a tumor in people, where individual cells just grow out of control, right? And that's why we see this kind of bulbous, knotty looking blob, which we call a gall. And this is very common on woody plants. Well, that's probably what you'll see it on most often when you're just, out and about. So galls on trees, I get calls about those every year. They can vary greatly in size from, that big or that big all the way up to, several feet across. Now, galls can be caused by bacteria, fungi, sometimes injury, but that's not going to be what I would call a true gall. That's more of an injury where it's grown over and tried to callus it over, but the layman's term for it is often used interchangeably. But with the pathogenic gall, they look a little different, like this one on the tree trunk. That is growing into the tree trunk, not just off of it. And it's disrupting the vascular system, so it's not like you can just cut that gall off and cure the tree. Like it's embedded in the tree. Just like with skin cancer, you can't just cut off. They have to scoop out underneath as well.
So in this circumstance with this tree, is that tree likely to die then? Or?
Oh yeah, it's going to die, definitely. Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry. Hold on. There we go. There's no way to save that tree because it's on the main trunk. If that were on a branch, you could maybe do something. But when it's on the main trunk, you can't really do much. So, the top right photo is another example of crown gall, but this is on a tree. And for scale, it's sitting on a pallet, like a wood pallet. So they can get quite large. And it's actually what is used to make burl wood. So that's a little silver lining. And that's used for veneers, inlays, jewelry boxes, fancy pens like there in the photo. And it can be really valuable, especially with really, galls like that. Because that whirly pattern is because the individual cells are overgrown, right? So it disrupts the pattern of the wood. So that's what gives it that nice, pretty swirly pattern.
Is it more prevalent in one kind of tree than another? Do you know what kind that is on the pallet?
No, I wouldn't say it's more prevalent on one or the other. Like agrobacterium, for example, which is what causes that one on the pallet, that infects hundreds of different plants. I think it just depends on what little ecosystem you're in, like what your environment is, and what's present is that'll influence what is most prevalent in that particular little micro environment. All right. All right, so root and crown rots are super common, especially this time of year with seed starting, and it's exactly what it sounds like. It's just mushy rot on the roots and crown. Now on this panel here, that far left is a healthy seedling. The one in the middle is dying, definitely well on its way to being completely dead. And you can see the obvious differences on the roots. They're discolored, they look kind of mushy, they're poorly developed or rotted away. Now look at over here on the right, you're right, yeah. We have discoloration, but we don't have a huge loss of biomass or development on the roots, right? And the seedling looks okay other than that discoloration. And this is a really good illustration of how plant diseases are not always a perfect health or completely dead situation. There's a spectrum of severity, and that will be really influenced by things like your environment. So how favorable was that environment for the pathogen? It will also be influenced by how much pathogen was present in the first place, and the general vigor of the plant host. So if you had a really robust, healthy, thriving seedling, it might perform more like that one on the right. If you had a seedling that was already stressed out, it might, and just struggling to live at all, it might perform more like that one in the middle. Also, things like fungicide treatments, for example, can help essentially negatively impact the pathogen. And could hypothetically be what we're looking at on that right seedling. That could be due to a fungicide treatment where it gave the plant a little head start. So there are a lot of factors that can play into how bad the disease situation is. Now, crown rot looks very similar. It's just where the roots have become infected and worked up to the crown, or in some cases the pathogen might be close to the surface of the soil, like right here, and it infects directly around here. I see that a lot in spinach, because on spinach, the older leaves will die off, and it lays there on the ground, and it's a source of food for a lot of our foliar pathogens in spinach. So it literally just lays under the canopy and makes spores and infects the crown area of the spinach. So that's pretty common. Yeah. All right, so this will typically be caused by fungi, often a complex of more than one. Sometimes I'll see a complex with fungi and nematodes. Typically that'll be in a field setting, not like in a seed starting tray. It's very unusual for me to see nematodes in a seed starting tray. Occasionally, if conditions are right, I will actually see this type of root rot due to bacteria. But the only time I've seen that is in like seedling trays that are on heat mats, and they're covered and kept really, really moist, like waterlogged moist. I have seen it occasionally in the field in southeast Arkansas with some flooding, and it was like 95 degrees. And we had a lot of soybeans that rotted away due to Bacillus bacterium. So it's Bacillus subtilis that causes that. But that's pretty, especially for here, rare. Like I've never seen that in the field here or in a garden in any fashion, only in seedling trays here, because we're just simply too dry. All right, so plant pathogens and disease examples. We're going to save the fungal group for later on because it's the biggest, and I like to kind of end the pathogen groups section with that, and it lays out nicely for where we'll have a break. So we'll start with bacteria. These are single-celled organisms. They are everywhere in the environment. The good news is only a very small portion can be pathogenic to plants, just like only a small portion can be pathogenic to people. In fact, many species of bacteria are essential for soil health and plant health, just like species of bacteria are essential for people. If we didn't have beneficial bacteria, we would all die because we wouldn't digest anything, right? So not all bacteria are bad bacteria. Now, the good news is most that cause disease in plants don't make people sick unless you're immune compromised. A colleague at Iowa State wrote up a nice little fact sheet about that, which you can find at that link. Now, it is important to remember that some bacteria that are pathogenic to people, but not on plants, can survive on plants, like on the surface in particular. Things like E. coli, Listeria, Salmonella, Shigella, and several others. I'm sure we've all heard about the lettuce recalls, spinach recalls, cantaloupe recalls, all of that. That's the source of the problem. So they're basically using the plant surface as a habitat. And when we have what I consider to be high-risk factors, like you have animals adjacent to your gardening, your food production area, particularly like pigs, cows, other ruminant animals, and especially when manures, like fresh manures, can run off, like with a heavy rain, it'll run off into your garden plot. That's a risky situation with food illness, right? Also, using fresh manures in your garden plot, I would not do. I only use aged manures or heat-treated manures. And honestly, that's not just due to the bacterial issue, but also the weed seed issue. Like horse and cow manure in particular are full of weed seeds. Like the worst pigweed I've ever seen on my parents' property was when my mom got a dump truckload of cow manure, like from what's it called? The pen by the barn where they hold them before they load them up on the truck. That. Yes, that. And it had so much pigweed seed in it, they had to just completely mow down their blackberries that year, because that's where she put it, was the blackberry bed, and it was just out of control. And it's just a very common problem to get huge weed seed loads in these manure lots, and it can be very detrimental to your efforts. So just be aware of that. Look for aged or composted or heat-treated manures.
Can't kill it either, you gotta dig it out.
Right, and well, pigweeds, they produce like hundreds of thousands of seed per plant.
Right.
And they can start producing seed, I think, at like 14 days old or 21 days old. So it's very much an uphill battle. And there's actually a lot of herbicide resistance in pigweed nowadays too, which is unfortunate. So just be mindful about where water flows when you get heavy rains, if you have animals on your property. Obviously, wash your produce. I mean, I can't say I've never eaten produce straight out of the garden, but like when my parents had chickens just wandering about, I did not just go pick a random strawberry and eat it, because they would go and just get on everything and, you know, put their little chicken poop on everything, and that just, ugh. Chickens gross me out a little bit. I mean, I love them, but at the same time, I'm a little icked out. It's the scales on the legs. They're like reptile legs. The feather-covered legs, I don't mind. Like silkies, those are cute, but I don't like the reptile legs. Anyway, so with bacteria, occasionally we can see bacteria. We're not going to see individual cells with the naked eye. Obviously, they're microscopic, right? And you have to have a really good microscope to be able to see that. But we can see them when they're by the millions, like on these wheat leaves up at the top. Where's my mouse? There we go. Here we have like what looks kind of like waterlogged tissue. That's called water-soaked tissue. And these droplets coming out are actually bacterial exudate. So these droplets are made up of millions of bacterial cells. That's what gives them that kind of like milky color. And also metabolic products of the bacteria. So if you were to touch that droplet, it would be a little like slimy, like thin snot kind of. And then you'll have a little bit of like plant sap and things like that mixed into, just because that's the nature of what we're dealing with. But if I were to take a toothpick and touch that to a droplet and then put that in a little tiny bit of water and put it under my good microscope in the lab, I would see like thousands and thousands and thousands of bacterial cells just from one tiny little dot. So let's think on that for a second. If you have those exudate droplets, which are common in the morning when it's nice and humid, and you have like either rain or you use a sprinkler nozzle to water your plants, what's happening with all that bacteria? Splashing everywhere, right? So that's why we don't water plants, we water the ground. So we don't water leaves, we water the soil. So how do bacteria get into plants in the first place? In the case of pathogenic, well, all bacteria, but especially pathogenic, this is what we're concerned about. Bacteria can get in through the stomata, which are those natural openings for gas exchange, right? They can get in through little hydothodes on the margins of the leaves, which is what you're looking at the top part on the drawing. And they can also get in through little tears or holes made by feeding by insects. And in some cases, not all, but some types of bacteria, which we'll talk about in a minute, can actually hitch a ride on insects, like inside their mouth, and they're transmitted that way through the insect spit. It's not really spit, but spit. So a few of them can move around like that. Not all, but a few. Okay, so for this class, I've kind of grouped the bacterial pathogens into two informal groups based on the symptomology and how the infection occurs. We have our leaf spot pathogens, and then vascular and what I call insect-aggravated pathogens. So leaf spots are exactly what they sound like, leaf spots. It looks kind of like a fungal leaf spot, but notice you have a more significant kind of yellow halo. Also, you'll have, let me find the spot. Basically, the spot will come up against a vein and then stop, like a major vein. I'm looking for one. I know there was a good one on here the other day. Here. There we go. That. See how it goes up to that major vein and then stops? That's a key suspicious thing for a bacterial leaf spot. And leaf spots can also occur on fruits as well. So that's still considered a leaf spot pathogen even though it's on the fruit. They're usually going to be the same thing. All right, now vascular and insect aggravated are things like bacterial wilts. You can see bacterial wilt in the top photo. And with bacterial wilts, you'll have that kind of water-soaked and limp appearance of the leaves. And at first, in the early stages, it'll look just like water stress. And they'll kind of look a little droopy, but you'll water them and they won't improve. And you'll, in very early stages, first see that at like peak heat of the day, because that's when you have the greatest water demand on the plant, and it can't suck up the water. And that is because if you look at this photo right there, that's what's happening in the vascular system. Not only is it physically getting clogged up with bacteria, but it's eating it away. So that's not a functioning vascular system. It cannot transport water. So these bacteria are not only eating away at the vascular system in the case of wilts, but they're also physically clogging it up, and those bacteria are releasing toxins that damage the tissue further. So it's very much an insult to injury type of situation. So these are spread easily by water splash, open wounds, and a lot of bacterial wilts have an insect vector or carrier that may spread them. So for prevention, we focus on preventing insect injury and keeping those insects under control, reducing our water splash and canopy humidity by making sure our plant spacing is adequate to ensure good airflow, and that might include some pruning up to make sure that it's not getting overly crowded. And removing infected plants and practicing good sanitation, so don't just pull it up and lay it down. You need to fully remove it. I choose to put my disease material in the trash. Some people compost it, but I wouldn't do that unless you are sure it gets up to temperature, like for a proper compost, and it's monitored. And then rotate your crops, so plant something else for a minimum of 1 year. And that includes no volunteers from like fallen old fruit that have gone to seed and reseeded themselves, and no weeds. For us in particular, because we have such a warm winter, we have a lot of winter weeds that can be a source of pathogen for our garden the next year. And we also have a lot of weeds that are actually related to a lot of our garden plants. So they can harbor the pathogen and give it kind of a bridge to the next season. So just keep that in mind. All right, so how can we tell if we have a bacterial wilt? There's a couple ways. The first is the cut stem method, and that's where you take the stem, you cut it with a razor blade, put it back together, and then slowly pull it apart about 1/8 of an inch to maybe like a 1/4 inch. And you're looking for these slimy little strings right here. And that is actually going to be much thicker and slimier than sap. And it's because the secretions of the bacteria, it's kind of like mucus-like, and that's why it's so stringy and like slimy. So that is trickier because you have to have really steady hands, and I don't. So I like the cup method, where you cut the stem and put it in a little cup of water, and then the bacteria will flow out. And I actually have a video. You guys have a little treat. Okay, so this is a stem. It's put in a little cup of water, and they put a dark background behind it to make it easy to see. And that is bacteria pouring out from the stem. And that's real time. Now that is a really severe infection. Sometimes you'll just have like one little tendril, but it looks kind of like they're squeezing toothpaste out of it, right? The key thing here is keep it steady and don't like knock the cup, because then it'll disrupt those streams and you won't be able to see it very well. I like to use like a kind of like a weird little modified paper clip situation. So I take a paper clip and stab it through the stem, and then I take another one and like hook it on and use like 4 or 5 paper clips to like create a little support on the top of the cup. I'm sure there's a better way to do that, but paper clips were free and I had them, so that's what works. So I've seen people use a binder clip or chopsticks or really anything that they have on hand. So just suspend it so you're not standing there holding it, because you're not going to be steady enough to give it the support that it needs to do that well. All right. So, can't see my mouse.
Still popcorn with the movie, huh?
There's donuts on it.
I mean, yeah.
I saw
There's some crackers. All right, so other vascular-associated bacteria that are not wilts include citrus greening. Now here y'all might have some patio citrus, but you don't have commercial citrus, but it's still a really important pathogen for the state, so I like to include it. So this is caused by a bacteria that infects the phloem of the citrus and does eventually kill the tree. It's a bacteria called Labirobacter huanglongbing, or HLB. It's vectored by the Asian citrus psyllid. This particular insect is endemic throughout the Caribbean and the southeast U.S., like Florida, the far south reaches of the U.S., I should say. It's not going to be up in Arkansas, for example. So it is here in Texas, unfortunately. So this is primarily spread by these little insects, but it can also be spread by people moving plant material like budwood, cuttings, leaves, even something as minor as a little branch that was broken off during harvesting and it's stuck on the pallet when they're hauling citrus. So when we have country-to-country quarantines of citrus, or even state-to-state, that's the type of stuff and the level of scrutiny that they're subjected to. They don't even want a stray leaf coming in. So how does that whole insect carrier or vector thing work? So we have our little insect here, and this is very small. That's a finger up at the top, right there. That's a finger, and that's how tiny these are. So it's not like you can just go out and catch them all. They're so small. They can easily sneak in and get through netting and stuff. The really fine mesh hardware cloth will keep them out, but you can't realistically put that around an entire citrus grove, So these little insects will go and feed on an infected plant. They get the bacteria internally, which we can see here on this expertly drawn little insect right here with the yellow bacteria. And then it goes to a new tree that is uninfected, and it has a special little mouth part called a proboscis. So it's gone to the leaf, it lands on the leaf, extends its little proboscis, which is kind of like a straw. It's very similar to the kind that a butterfly has, just much smaller. And it uses that to pierce the leaf, and then it starts feeding on the vascular system. So it's a phloem-feeding insect. So the bacteria then, through its salivary compounds, or saliva compounds, the bacteria, those little yellow dots, are introduced into the vascular tissue of the plant. And over some time, the bacteria will divide and multiply, right? We go from 2 to 4 to 8 to 16 to 32. And in a very short period of time, we're up in the millions because it's doubling every time. We get physical clogging up of that vascular tissue. And again, those bacteria are also secreting toxins and things like that into the plant. So what is this weird little picture in the middle on the bottom right there? That is actually the vascular tissue of a plant. So down, I can't see my mouse, the glare is really bad. Okay, so there's the vascular bundle right here, right? And vascular bundles are like collections of little straws, right? So what we're looking at in this middle picture is like the end of the straw. So if this is like a phloem tube, we're looking down the end, like in the straw hole. So that stuff right there, all that stuff that looks like little kind of cylinders or ovals, those are bacterial cells, and you can see there's thousands of them glommed up in there inside the vascular tissue of that plant. So hopefully that clarifies the whole insect carrier vector thing. All right, so for context, just in Florida, and these numbers are old, these are like 8-year-old numbers, there has been a 80% reduction in Florida citrus grown, and as of 2016, over $4.6 billion and over 30,000 jobs have been lost. I would say it's more than double that now, easily. Have you noticed that there's no longer commercials for like Florida's own orange juice? Like the grower cooperative owned orange juice? That's why, because they just don't. And it's not like they can just replant because it takes 5+ years to get them productive, and by then the trees are already infected again, and it's kind of a waste of money. There is research going on like treating this and dealing with it. There have been some advancements made recently that will hopefully be fruitful in the next few years, but there's also some alternative production methods being looked at for like places like Louisiana. So it has multiple benefits of like we're protecting it from disease like citrus greening, but also they have a system where they can protect it from cold snaps, because Louisiana can kind of grow citrus, but once in a while they get cold snaps that are a problem. So they do what's called high density citrus. Well, they're doing some research on high density citrus. And basically they have a little fine mesh hardware cloth greenhouse, and they grow these citrus trees very similar to like a bonsai style, where they're heavily pruned, they're kept very compact, they're in like 20-gallon pots, I think, and they're really pushed to the max on their nutrient management and watering regimen, and they're incredibly productive, like per unit input of fertilizer and water. They're looking really promising. Like, I might look at taking on some trials for here in Texas in the next few years, just because it looks a lot more feasible, especially with our water issues. I don't know if you know, but in the valley, we've actually had a lot of citrus problems, not only just citrus greening, but water issues. Like the irrigation from the Rio Grande is becoming very sparse and not available at some times. So looking at something that's a drip irrigation system that's more efficient than a traditional grove could potentially provide a little relief for our producers. All right, so what do symptoms look like up close? With citrus greening, we have discolored, misshapen fruit. It will often taste really bitter. And you can also have raised or thickened looking veins. We call those corky looking. And here in Texas, we typically will see this mottling, not mottle like strut down the runway, but like mottle with a T, like patchy color, like M-O-T-T-L-I-N-G. And that's where we just have very irregular, uneven distribution of yellowing and kind of too dark a green. So currently, because we don't have any curative management, we focus on detection and removing infected trees. That could be a source of infection, and also for monitoring for quarantine purposes. So some people do spray for the vector, but because they're so tiny, it's really difficult to make sure you're getting good coverage with your spray. But also, if you spray today and 2 weeks later you have a windstorm and it blows in some of those psyllids, you're still gonna get the pathogen in there on those psyllids, right? And we are really limited on what systemic insecticides we can use because this is a food crop. So we have some pretty strict limitations on insecticide use. So we focus on early detection and action to try to limit that spread. And we really focus on protecting citrus, like commercial production areas. We do have it in Texas, but there's still a lot of effort on preventing significant establishment of this in California, and hopefully that will be maintained. There's, at the website listed on this slide, there's some more information about current quarantine maps. Currently, we use DNA screening. It is super sensitive and very reliable because we include positive and negative controls with each run of the test. So if anything goes wrong, those controls will tell us that it's not working correctly. So it's very trustworthy and reliable data. However, a false negative is possible if you don't get the right sample just due to random chance. You know, like if you don't happen to sample the right tree. And is it time or money efficient to sample every single tree in a grove? We can't afford to do that like consistently. And also, can we afford to do that every couple weeks for years and years and years? Not really. So there's been some work looking at the use of dogs to do scent work to find infected trees. I think they're looking for changes in the plant in response to the pathogen, like the smell molecules due to, that occur due to the metabolic changes in the plant. And that seems to be working well, but it's really difficult to create essentially a validated test, because how do you verify a dog? Like, it's not like a lab test where we can, you know, do checks and have like, you know, double controls and things like that. So getting that acceptable for like a USDA level quarantine is tricky. But it's a really interesting project, and it's a really good example of how plant pathologists, as well as state, like Texas Department of Ag, like TDA, are working on some creative solutions to addressing some of these problems in a reasonably efficient type of way. Now, if you have more questions about citrus greening, I always refer to Femi Alabi. He's my counterpart in Weslaco. He, is where most of our citrus is. That's where all our commercial citrus is. So he's our foremost person for citrus greening. What time does this class go to?
Right, 1.
1? Okay.
About 10 to 1.
Okay. All right, so an example a little closer to home is Xylella. This causes Pierce's disease in grapes, which we can see here on this photo. You can see that middle one right there. It looks stunted and yellow and kind of scorched, almost like drought stress, but it's not. It's infected with Pierce's disease. Xylella bacteria, they're a group of bacteria. And other species can cause pecan, olive, and shade tree scorches. We don't have any cures for this, unfortunately. This particular pathogen does live in the plant vascular tissue as well, and in the vectors. There are many insect vectors that can spread this. In Pierce's disease, the glassy winged sharpshooter, which is this little insect, spreads it around. Now, these are also very, very small. They're like maybe half the width of a pencil eraser, so very, very small. Additional treatments are being researched. There have been some efforts to mitigate this disease with using bacteriophages, which is a virus that only eats bacteria, that eats Xylella. But the challenge has been trying to get that into the plant. We can't just spray it on the outside, it doesn't just absorb. So we have to get it in the plant. Well, how do you do that with a woody plant? So they've tried injections, they've tried slow drip, essentially slow drip injection, like gravity-fed injection. And it's just had a lot of challenges with getting good establishment of the bacteriophage in plants, and it's really labor heavy. So that's been a bit of a challenge. But it's really interesting, and who knows, in another couple of years there might be a great new tool to deliver the treatment and to get better control of this. Some varieties of grapes are more tolerant than others. So, honestly, for homeowner use, I just recommend planting a tolerant variety. And that's easiest. But for vineyards, certain types of wine grapes are highly susceptible to this, which is why it's such a problem. We have a lot of wine grapes in the hill country, and it's a problem in other states too. It's not just us. All right, so bacterial soft rot is a really common problem in vegetables. And these bacteria all make enzymes that degrade plant tissue, specifically the cellulose. The cellulose is what gives plant cells their rigid structure, right? That's the hard cell wall part. And it's what makes wood woody, right? So it's that really tough stuff. So the bacteria, they make special enzymes that digest just that, and that's why it causes the soft, squishy rot, because it's getting rid of the rigid cell wall structure. This is most problematic or most noticed late season and post-harvest, and is really problematic in cabbage, lettuce, spinach, onions, carrots, peppers, and any vegetable we store for a long time in particular. And that's partly because if you're storing it for a long time, it has more time to sit there and come in contact with other produce that's adjacent. So when you might have put a box of onions in your pantry and one had it, a couple months later, after you've rifled around in there a few times and got bacteria on your hands and touched over 10 other onions, all of a sudden half the box is bad because there's been more points of contact with that and spread it with your hands. So we prevent by limiting insect injury, because this is getting access to the plant or entering the plant primarily pre-harvest on that initial infection before it spreads to all the neighbors in your handling and storage of these produce items. Then remove anything that is even suspicious before it goes into storage. Like this carrot, you would need to not put that carrot away. Even if it only had that one little spot, I would not put that carrot in the bin. I would just keep it aside or throw it away. Just because it's not worth losing half of your harvest because it sat in the bin and had contact with all these other carrots while it was in storage and spread the bacteria to them. Make sense? Cool.
If you eat something that's not showing that, is that something that makes you sick or no? This isn't one of those that makes you sick?
We all already have. Like, it's so common. I mean, we've ingested many. Actually, the average person has the genetic material of over a dozen plant viruses in your gut system at any given time.
Oh,
So,
great. Yeah.
I know, right? So if just the viruses are that common, the bacteria is probably just as common. But I've only seen a research paper about the virus part. So, but yeah, it's really common. I mean, obviously, if you were to eat like the really nasty part of that cabbage in its entirety, you might have some trouble. I think largely because once you get like one microbe in there, a lot of times you'll get multiple decomposers going once that initial soft rot starts.
I think it would be hard to eat that, though.
It would. It would. But, you know, people have done stranger things. Yeah. Right? Yeah. Yeah, I mean, you would really test the robustness of your immune system. But yeah, like if it's just a tiny little bit, it would taste kind of gross, but you wouldn't really notice. Honestly though, with a lot of these, especially the things that are already a little smelly like onions and cabbage, it's gonna smell so bad that you won't get it close to your face, much less eat it. Like the onions that have bacterial soft rot, it smells like hot trash and like bad eggs together. Yeah, it's gross. Yeah, it's very, very pungent. Yeah, like I've had like onion samples with bacterial soft rot that were in a Ziploc in my fridge and they still stunk up the entire half the building where my lab is. So when I say it's strong, it's strong. I was that girl. I'm still that girl. Like the ladies in the front office from time to time, they're like, what's that smell? And they will literally move across the hall and take their little laptop. And I'm just like,
They're just sissies.
yeah, I'm like, y'all. So yeah, I mean, we had porta potties at the Uvalde Center for like almost 2 years because they were renovating our bathrooms and they had some problems. Yeah, I know, I'm just saying, you can tell those of us that work in the field because we were unfazed. We're just like, hey, at least we got these, you know, but a lot of the other staff were a little horrified and would walk to the far back building. And we're just like, have fun with that. All right, so viruses. These are submicroscopic. Many are spread by vectors or insect carriers. Some are spread by mechanical means, and some by seed. There's yellowing and loss of vigor and death of the plant in some cases. And common insect vectors include aphids, spider mites, whiteflies, thrips. Those are the most common that I can think of off the top of my head. So viruses can look highly varied with their symptoms. Here we have tomato spotted wilt virus on a peanut leaf and tomato spotted wilt virus on a tomato. So we have two very different plants here. A peanut is a legume, a tomato is a solanaceous or nightshade crop, right? Very different. I mean, they're both plants, but they're in totally different families. So both of these can get tomato spotted wilt virus, and that could be a little confusing. But once you know kind of a little secret about virus naming, it makes more sense. So a virus is named by what the first host it was found on was, and then the symptom, and then the word virus. So this was first found on tomato. It causes spotted wilt virus. So if you're thumbing through a seed catalog and like there's some tomatoes that say cucumber mosaic resistant, it's not a typo. It's supposed to be that way because a lot of viruses can infect many different families of plants. And like tobacco mosaic virus, for example, can infect hundreds of different plants. So some of them are quite diverse with their plant host. Here's another look at some virus symptoms where we have mottling, again with the T, not the D, and puckering, that's called epinasty, where you have like malformed growth, and just general, it looks overly waxy, like it doesn't look right. I know it's kind of hard to see on that one, but like these leaves are more shiny. I'm trying to find my mouse. Like these are more shiny than a regular leaf, right? So the surface can also look different from the norm. Now some viruses can look a little bit more like a nutrient deficiency. So it can be a little tricky sometimes to tell what's what. And I always say get a soil test. Like before you even start doing anything, get a soil test. It's like $20 and it's definitely worth it. You can get the micronutrient analysis for I think like $50 maybe through Texas A&M, which is the best price I've found. Like, I use them for my research stuff because they're a lot more affordable than the companies. And they always have like really prompt service, you know, it's like maybe a couple weeks, if that, depending on the time of the year, sometimes faster. So I've been very pleased with the customer service on their end though. So 10 out of 10 would recommend. But with this virus symptom here on this bramble, that looks kind of like it could be a nutrient deficiency, right? But if we look closer at the pattern of the symptom, sorry, there's like glare from the blinds and I'm trying to see. All right, there we go. So if we look here at this leaf, look along the midrib and divide it in two across the midrib. This side has that yellow symptom. The other side does not. If it were a nutrient deficiency, I would expect it to be more uniform across a single leaf. So to my eye, that's a red flag for a viral issue. So pattern of the symptoms can be a helpful tool in pointing us the right way. All right, so for prevention, we focus on preventing infection because there's no cure for viruses. So prevent infection through vector control, use clean stock, don't try to take cuttings from sick plants, and sanitize your tools, and cull affected plants. As long as you sanitize between plants, then that's good. Like if you're cutting roses, for example, I would definitely sanitize between plants. Certainly on shared tools, sanitize between like people for sure, obviously. Now, there are a lot of things you can sanitize your tools with. Some people like to use bleach and then oil their tools afterwards so it doesn't completely ruin their tools. Some people like Lysol. The thing with any disinfectant though is you have to follow the instructions on how long it's supposed to sit. So Lysol is a few minutes and you're supposed to let it be wet with the Lysol or generic brand Lysol, you know, Equate or whatever. Like it has to be wet with standing moisture from the disinfectant for, I think it's like 5 minutes, maybe. Just read the package and that'll tell you what you need to know. I've actually recently switched to a disinfectant called Sporocidin, and it is the same thing that a lot of dentist offices used to use. You know the dentist office smell? That's what it is. It is really flammable, so just beware. You're probably not going to use it in the lab next to a burner like I do, but like I always have to make sure that all fire is off before I spray it, just to be safe. But it's really effective and it works pretty quickly. I've also been using Thymol, which I like because it doesn't like ruin your clothes like bleach does, and it seems to work pretty well and it works pretty quickly as well. And I buy that in concentrate and just like mix it up because it's a lot cheaper. Yeah, Thymol. It's a plant-derived disinfectant. Now those work. Okay, so Sporocidin works for viruses, bacteria, and fungus. Thymol I know works for bacteria and viruses. I don't remember if it works for fungus or not, but I don't use it in an area where I need fungal disinfectant. So, but just make sure you're reading, you know, the label to make sure it has activity toward the desired organism. So, and then cull your affected plants is the last thing. So even if it's a beloved plant, you need to remove it promptly because otherwise it will sit there and be a repository of the pathogen and infect all your neighbor plants. And just because it's a different type of plant doesn't mean it can't get infected, right? Like if you have a sick tomato plant and it's next to some cucumber plants, don't feel a false sense of security that, oh, it can't jump from tomatoes to cucumbers. It can, and it will. All right, so I have recently started including this slide because I feel like it's helpful to get a better idea of the scale of the things we're talking about because it's very abstract if it's not something you deal with like every day, right? So here's something a little familiar. Pollen grains, or human egg, are right here at, they're a little below 1 millimeter. So I know we don't use metric here, but do you all remember roughly what 1 millimeter is? Like about the width of a screw on the glasses, like on the frame. That's about 1 millimeter. So, where's my mouse? Oh, there we go. Okay, so here's a frog egg. And then about 2/3 of the way down, we're going down by a factor of 100 with every tick mark. So here we have a pollen grain or a human egg, go down another factor of 100 for the next bracket, and we have plant cells and animal cells. Now with a decent light microscope, you can still see plant and animal cells. You're not gonna see like exquisite detail of those, but you'll see some major structures all right, right? Now, and this whole section, okay, this section you can see with a light microscope, which is what you think of when we say microscope, like the traditional, you know, you have the eyepiece and you look through it and you have the little glass slide and you put it here and you look, right? So that's what you would see with this. But this end of the light microscope range, you need a really good light microscope, like several $1,000 light microscope to see that. Like I have one that when it was new probably cost $2,000. I inherited it and I cannot see this level with it. I can kind of see here with the strongest power, but I can't go this small. But there are some that can go that small. They're just like 50 grand and fancy. So we're getting smaller and smaller. So we're at the cells, red blood cells. Here's mitochondria. So for scale, this mitochondria is that like kind of yellowy orange blob right there and right there. And then we're getting smaller and smaller. So here's a flu virus. So viruses vary greatly in size. Flu viruses are pretty big. And they're substantially smaller than even a mitochondria. Now, plant viruses are going to be smaller than a flu virus with the exception of a couple. I cannot see my mouse. There we go. So they're going to be like right in here for plant viruses. So on the other end of the scale, though, here are proteins right here. The glare from the blinds is so bad, sorry guys. So that's a protein. So to put that into context, a protein is what makes up the outside lining of a virus particle, right? And these little things right here, these lipids, 2 layers of lipids, like butt to butt, or red part to red part, I think, will be the outer layer of this membrane right here. So hopefully that kind of puts that into context with scale, because I know it's really hard to envision that when it's not something that you deal with a lot, other than me saying, it's really tiny, which I get a lot of blank faces of like, well, yeah, it is tiny, but how tiny? So anyway, this section is a light microscope. That's the really good light microscope. There's another type of microscope, though, called an electron microscope, and it can see from here all the way down to a really good one with a really good technician could see like almost at the atomic level, right? So they work very differently than a light microscope. They actually take a beam of electrons, shoot it at your specimen there on the little tiny little platform within the machine. It's like an enclosed box. And then it has these special sensors, kind of like cameras, and the electrons bounce off of your specimen, and these sensors receive those electrons, and then a computer translates that into an image. So why do we care about that? Right? Like, why is this nerd going on and on about this? Well, electron microscopy was transformative in virology because now we could see viruses. Before we could not see viruses. So we were then able to see and understand them and their structure better than we ever could before. And electron microscopy not only changed human virology, but plant virology as well. So we're going to kind of take a little jaunt to Europe mentally and talk about an event in the 17th century called tulip mania. And during this time, people really valued these striking looking bulbs with the streaky pattern on the petals and the leaves. It's called breaking. And they would pay huge sums of money for just a few bulbs. And after a few years, these bulbs would kind of peter out and they couldn't propagate them and they just would die. And people didn't understand why. Later, they realized in the 20th century that this was actually caused by a virus called the tulip breaking virus. So people were buying and trading infected plants, and that's why the line of it would kind of just eventually peter out and die out, and they couldn't propagate it. Now, we do currently have some modern varieties that are bred to look that way without the virus. So if you have some tulips that look like that, don't freak out. It's probably not the virus. But what do you think happened in the mid-20th century? Well, but electron microscopy was invented. So we were able to see it and visualize the virus for the first time. So what is this grainy looking weird photo over here? That's actual virus particles of the tulip breaking virus. So it looks like a strand of spaghetti with a slinky wrapped around it pretty tightly. So the virus particle is made up of genetic material and proteins, and that's it. So the middle part, the spaghetti, is the genetic material, and then the slinky wrapped around it is the protein. And that protein on the outside protects it and keeps the genetic material from being like bombarded with stuff from the environment, right? So, there we go. This is what it looks like from the end. So here's our piece of spaghetti with a slinky. We're looking at it on the end right here. So that, where's my mouse? I'm still looking for my mouse, hold on. There we go, okay. This right here is the end. So that little tiny circle in the middle, that's the genetic material area. And then the spirals that look kind of like a pinwheel, that's the slinky wrapped around it. So you're seeing the coils of the protein slinky. The slinky is not the real name, but it looks like a slinky. So we were able to visualize the virus, and that really clarified a lot of things, and people started realizing, oh, hey, this is actually the same virus infecting 20 different plants, because we could see the virus and its features. All right, so tulip-breaking virus is a really great example of a plant disease affecting economics, and I think it's less depressing than like the Irish potato famine. I mean, people lost fortunes, but people didn't starve to death over tulips, thankfully. And there's more information at that link right there. There's a whole write-up on tulip-breaking virus that's really interesting. So an example closer to home is rose rosette, and this particular virus causes malformed growth of misshapen thorns, reddish leaves, overproliferation of leaves and buds. Oftentimes you'll have like way too many buds. Like if you should only have one per the variety, you'll have 20, and they'll be too small and kind of twisted. And if they do even open, you might have like an incorrect number of petals per the variety. Like you might have 5 petals instead of 45. And they'll be streaky and miscolored. So this is spread primarily by spider mites. Those do it very, very well, so well, in fact, that we actually use that for experiments. Like virologists have little cages that they put their spider mites in and set it over a plant. And then some poor grad student has to brush them off with a paintbrush and count them, and then put them in a new cage and move them to the next plant. So they're very efficient spreaders of this disease. It can be spread by not sanitizing your tools between pruning cuts when you go plant to plant. And it can be spread by physical disturbance. So if you handle the leaves or something, get some sap on your hands, and then go handle another, you can spread it that way. Though that way is not nearly as efficient as, say, the mites. This does result in plant decline or eventual death on susceptible varieties. So we focus on prevention with don't take cuttings from sick plants, even if it looks fine. On that particular part, remember, it's like an iceberg. There's a lot more than what we're seeing. Space your plants so they don't touch, so it's harder for spider mites to go plant to plant to plant. Sanitize your tools. Remove any wild or multiflora roses. You don't have too many of those here. They're more prevalent in like North Texas and in Arkansas. I mean, they're so prevalent there. People planted them as like fence lines like decades ago, and they've naturalized, and now they're just like bramble patches, but not brambles, they're just wild roses. Anyway, so thankfully that's not a big burden for you guys here, because they're very difficult to manage. And then remove infected plants as soon as possible. So here's another view. Yes?
Can you purposely poison the plant to kill those? You know,
Like with herbicide?
With something,
I mean,
herbicide, because then the plant will take it into itself and then kill off will it kill off those little
well, it'll kill the virus, but it'll also kill your plant. You know, like it'd be easier just to remove it, because then like while the plant's dying, it could still be a source of inoculum for other plants, right? Versus if you just remove it, then it's gone immediately, and we don't have that like window of a few days where it could continue to spread.
Well, I was on a different thread. I was like, okay, if you kill the plant and it'll kill all those bacteria or viruses, and then it'll kind of like, it won't go into the dirt.
Correct. These will not.
So then you can like take it out.
Yes, you can.
Because to me, it seems like if you just pulled it out, it would still have the tendency to spread, no matter where, unless you put it in some kind of thing and burned it or something.
Yeah, I mean, you could bag it up or burn it, whichever. I mean, obviously, if you have a burn ban, you can't burn. But if you don't, then I would recommend just burning it because it's a lot more efficient than trying to put it in your trash.
Hard to do in a truck when you're on a burn ban.
I know. Uvalde has the same struggle.
Burn ban, you can still container burn.
Yeah, like with the little fire pits. You know, like in Uvalde, we have a burn ban, but you can still have a little contained fire for cooking and like, you know, like the little solo stove type things. So,
Unless you have an HOA that says no.
well, there's a reason we moved to a neighborhood without an HOA. So, yeah. But, all right, so here's another view of rose rosette, and you can see what it looks like on a bush. So look here, we have leaves that are discolored, but no really malformed growth on the larger bush, right? But this little shoot here has some pretty significant malformed growth, where it's over-proliferated, it's too red, it just looks wrong, right? So we could not just prune that branch out and call it good, because that particular branch has grown after infection. So this plant was infected on the main bush down here. So with viruses, existing growth is not going to suddenly look malformed, right? Only the new growth will look the most malformed.
Do you have to take the whole thing out? You have to kill that whole thing?
Yeah, I know.
So I'm hearing no wrong.
I don't. Well, in Uvalde, it's so much drier there. It's dry here, but there, we're like 20 miles from desert, so it's just a battle. But actually, there's a current research project that Kevin Ong, who's our ornamental specialist, is doing with, I think, Missouri and TDA, and they're looking at a variety trial to find some better roses that are truly resistant to rose rosette. So, yes.
How prevalent is that?
I think it's more prevalent than we thought like 10, 15 years ago, because I think there was just lack of essentially mapping it. But it's not like in every single yard. Like, it's less common here than it is in Arkansas. It's a lot more common in like northwest Arkansas because it's a lot more lush there. You have more spider mite pressure. Here, it's like you'll have pockets of it across the state, if that makes sense. All right, so here's another view of a virus. These are petunias. This is tobacco mosaic virus on petunias in a nursery. And look at these older leaves. They're discolored, but they're not terribly misshapen. Versus look at this new growth. We have a doubling up of the meristematic tissue. The leaves are more cupped and small. Like, even for young leaves, they look kind of too small. And that's a classic example of the progression of symptoms with time. So I would say this little plant was infected way back here on these older leaves. And this new growth has been put on since it was infected. So our most visually striking symptoms are going to be on the stuff that's grown since it was infected. And our most malformed growth will follow that rule as well. All right, so in vegetables, we have a lot of viruses. There's over 12 in tomatoes alone. Most of them that will infect our tomatoes also infect our peppers and our cucurbits. There's no treatment or cure for viruses, so we really focus on vector control. Make sure your insects don't get out of control. And make sure that you're not taking clippings from sick plants. Be mindful of handling sick plants or suspected sick plants and then handling other plants. Also, if you use tobacco products in any fashion, you need to make sure you wash your hands really well, like before you handle any plants, because tobacco mosaic virus is actually so tough and durable that it can survive the cigarette making process and the chew making process and actually get on your hands when you use those products, and then you can transmit them to vegetables and ornamentals. That's why in like commercial nurseries, there are very strict no smoking and no tobacco product policies on the property, and they have like special sanitizer stations for people who use those products. So just be aware of that. All right, so on to nematodes. So nematodes are microscopic worms. These infect plants and feed on nutrients. Now, not all nematodes are plant pathogenic. Only a small portion of them are. There are many nematodes that live in the soil that are just part of soil ecosystem. They eat bacteria or fungus. They're harmless to plants. But the ones that do infect plants, most of them are root feeders. There are a few species that can be foliar feeding nematodes, but I've never come across those. I've heard they can happen in strawberries and hostas here in Texas, but we don't grow a lot of hostas in this area, at least not that I've had samples of. But the thing with plant pathogenic nematodes that makes them different from all other nematodes is they have a very special mouth part called a stylet, and that's what we call a diagnostic feature. So here's a nematode right here. That little straw-looking thing is the stylet. Here it is up close, and it pokes out, like they have muscles and they can poke it out to pierce the plant with. And they use that to suck out nutrients from the plant. So it's very much like a little straw. It's like a portable straw. But that's what we call diagnostic feature of a plant pathogenic nematode. It's very specific to them. So a lot of vegetables can get root knot nematode, which is the most commonly seen simply because it's the most visually obvious. It causes the big galls or knots. But there are several species or types here in Texas. The prevalence depends on your soil type. Some like sandy soil, some nematodes like clay soil, some don't really care, they can do fine wherever. So some nematodes have a very wide host range, some are very specific. Like some types of nematode will only infect one crop, but others like root knot nematode will infect many different crops. So they are really difficult to manage because there's a lack of labeled products for homeowners and honestly for commercial producers too. And they live in the soil, so it's really difficult to get good coverage in the soil of any product anyway without using incredibly high volumes of application, which isn't really feasible for most people. Now, among plant pathogenic nematodes, we have two groups based on their feeding habits. It's called migratory and sedentary. And so migratory nematodes feed by using that little mouth part to pierce the plant root, suck out some nutrients, and then they scoot over. And then they do that again and suck out some nutrients and do it over and over. So they create lots of little puncture wounds in the roots while sucking out nutrients. A sedentary nematode, like root knot nematode, here on pecan, is going to go to the root, find that little stylet, or go to the root, poke out its little stylet, and suck out nutrients, and it's going to stay there for the rest of its life. And in the case of root knot nematode, only the females feed. So that female will then eventually, if she completes her life cycle, be filled with eggs, and that will be part of the gall that you see here. So the gall is going to be part female nematode. Here's an early infection stage close up. So here's a root. That brown part is a dead female nematode, and that's the egg mass inside the female nematode. And so the site where the nematode feeds is actually called, it's a giant cell or feeding site, labeled with the G there, and there's a nematode that's not matured yet, but it's actually partially embedded here, and that stylet is poking in, and it's secreting some salivary compounds into the plant. And that's acting on the growth regulation of that area, so those cells will become too big, and they actually make a lot more food, so a lot of more sugars than they should. And that's the majority of the gall that you see on that top photo, is cells that are way too big, and the nematode's literally just made its own little buffet right there. So it's feeding itself with its giant cell feeding site. So
the tree that you showed us with the galls, is this from the same?
It looks similar, but it's a different pathogen.
And then do these go into the plant, or they are from the outside?
These are half in, half out. Well, maybe not half and half, but part in, part out. So, what else? So with these nematodes, though, if you send in a sample and you get a report back from the plant clinic and it says you have 500 nematode juveniles and eggs per pound of soil, let's say, that you sent in, that's what they're measuring, are those eggs, and then juveniles that are still like in the molting stages within their little capsule.
Okay, in your soil or in your plant?
Usually you'll send a soil sample, but you can send in both or a mix of both.
Okay,
So.
if you have like a curtain, you know, it's got that one big leaf and it's got all that prettiness in it, then you have that other kind that has the little swirly things, the curtains. How do you know if it's really a virus or bacteria that you have other than just a, what is it, a cell whatever, you know?
Honestly, send it into the lab. Like take a specimen, send it to the lab, yeah. I mean, I have a lab in Uvalde, but it is much smaller than the hub lab in College Station. They have all the bells and whistles, and they have like a third of a building to themselves. I have one room that's a sixth the size of this room, maybe. And, yeah, so I don't have a clean room and a dirty room. It's all one room. It has a clean-ish corner and then a dirty rest of it. Because you have a dirty area where you bring in soil and plants, and then your clean area is for all your sterile activities. Okay. So I just have a clean-ish corner, and I use a lot of like antibiotics and stuff in my media. But yeah, just send it in because it's very difficult to tell unless you have like the expertise or they have little test strips that we can buy. I don't think y'all could buy, but we can buy them. But they're really expensive because you have to buy like 20 at a time, and they're $15 a piece. So unless you're going to be doing a lot of testing, it's not cost effective. And then you also have to pay for overnight like dry ice shipping, which is really expensive. So yeah, we have things like test strips, DNA testing that we can do. Also visual inspection using microscopes. I do a lot of that so I can have really fast turnaround times for my clients. So yeah, for you guys, just send it in.
Because it was like that petunia with the little curtain, I would be thinking, oh, that's a new thing.
Now, sometimes you can have deformed growth due to injury, like during early development of the meristematic tissue. You can have like insect chewing or even just like an animal pinched off a little piece. As that grows, it'll look more and more malformed because that meristematic tissue was damaged, or even just at a young stage. So there can be a lot of reasons you have funky looking leaves.
But this sounds like we're all screwed down.
I know.
I mean,
Sorry, guys.
the thing is, I mean,
Here in Texas, that's like.
I have a skewed perception. Yeah, I have a skewed perception because I get all these samples, so I'm like, oh, look at all this death, it's horrible. But, I mean, statistically, it's much more likely that you're going to have like a crop injury or something, like heat stress or sun scald or something like that, because you don't have to have all three things of the disease triangle present at the same time. So, I mean, they are pretty common, but also plants are really good at surviving generation to generation. You just might not have perfectly beautiful tomatoes.
So what's like the best thing you can do to prevent one of those growth, one of the three things?
I think when we get to the management section, it'll click for you. Yeah. Yes. This is like the low point of the presentation where everyone feels depressed and hopeless. I promise. We're starting the uphill climb soon.
So we're not the first people who asked
No. This is the normal progression. This is like the grief process. You're at the lowest depression. You'll move on to acceptance and hope by the end. All right, so prevention. We plant with resistant plant varieties, prevent infestation, so inspect all your transplants, and then use crop rotation to plant something different in that spot, being careful of avoiding alternative hosts, because a lot of these can infect multiple hosts. Yes?
All these three, can you get them in a raised bed too? That's up off the ground?
Off the ground?
Yeah.
It'd be a lot harder to get nematodes in there unless you're using like soil, not like potting mix to fill it. But I mean, you can get viruses or bacteria anywhere because they travel on insects and splash. Okay, so here's an example of nematodes in the field. So here we have spinach, and it should be really dense like there in the back of the photo, but notice how sparse it is. And when we look at it up close, that's left one is how a spinach plant should look like, and the one on the right is what the sad ones look like. When we look at it up closer, you can see the damage those nematodes have done to the roots. So obviously those root systems cannot function properly. So they're going to not get enough nutrients, not get enough water. Also, the nematodes are not only essentially blocking that from going up the roots, it's also taking sugars made through photosynthesis. So it's kind of like a double whammy. I know. All right, so do you guys mind if we just skip the break since we're running short on time? You can get, this is informal, you can get up and go if you need to and just come back. It can spread chemical signals from one to the next. All right, so again, this is the group we usually see, like visually as well. The appearance is highly diverse. It can be microscopic, like in the case of this bread mold. We've all seen bread mold, right? Have you ever opened a little bread bag and a poof of dust comes out? That's not dust. Those are fungal spores. So here, this has been dyed purple, so you can see it better. Where's my mouse? There we go. So that's purple. And these little dots are actually cloned little spores of the adult parent fungus. Well, the parent fungus. So it buds off little clones of itself. And yeah, so that's the more familiar, comfortable bread mold. We've all seen that, right? Now, something a little different is jelly ear fungus, which you can see on this bottom photo. That's also a reproductive structure of a fungus. That looks very different, right? Much bigger, totally different shape, whole different ball game. Whoa, wrong way, hold on, there we go. And here we have a bracket or conch fungus, also called a shelf fungus. So that looks, yet again, very different. And those can be 2 feet across. So size, shape, and appearance varies greatly within fungal reproductive structures. So we're going to shift gears and look at mycelium for a minute. This is the body of the fungus, or the part that's kind of root-like. This makes up the bulk of the biomass of the fungal organism, and this colonizes the substrate, whether that's a dead log, the soil, your favorite tomato plant, whatever. It's what colonizes and is root-like. It also absorbs nutrients, right? Kind of like roots, but it's actively secreting enzymes and other products to break down its immediate environment into food products for itself. So it is kind of root-like, but with extra steps, because it can't make its own food. So, like in mass, it's called the mycelium. A single little thread-like piece is called a hyphae, which you can see in the diagram. And if you look at the bottom drawing, you can see that the reproductive structure, this little familiar mushroom, that's just modified hyphae bundled together. And here we can see the mycelium with individual hyphae. That's on the surface of a log when someone's peeled back the bark, and you can kind of see the tips going into the log. Okay, we're going to shift back to fungal reproductive structures, and notice these are very intertwined because the hyphae are what make the reproductive structures and the spores, right? So it's very interdependent. So spores are similar to seeds in that when they land on a surface and they have a good environment, they'll germinate. Notice some of the terminology is even the same. They germinate. And the difference is rather than germinating a radicle or root, they germinate a hyphae or a germ tube. So this little bottom left, that the green is a leaf surface. That's a spore. It has germinated a hyphae that is going to try to get in through that stomata. Now, some types of fungus can actually force their way in between the epidermis cells of the surface. They have this specialized little structure that builds up high pressure and it forces its way in. Now, once that happens, once it gains access into the plant, no matter how that happened, what happens? The hyphae, or mycelium, will then colonize inside the plant, which we can see here. So this is the inside of a stem. The thread-looking stuff is the hyphae. Here's the inside of a leaf. The leaf is the kind of tannish color. The hyphae has been dyed blue so you can see it better. And you can see how extensively it grows in there, very much like a root, right? And it's absorbing nutrients from that plant material. So a fungal colony, as it grows, will keep branching off and branching off and branching off in search of more food and resources, right? And that's usually going to be in a roughly circular, sometimes oval-ish pattern, like you can see on the top. But a single spore can make an entire colony, and that colony can be this big, or it can be like many yards wide. So these can get very enormous.
I think the largest living structure on the planet
It's a fungal colony, yeah. It's like many, many miles across. It's crazy. Yep. All right, so what do fungal spores look like? Obviously, that one on the bottom left is kind of teardrop shaped and a little spiky. Here's some other ones that are dark colored and have subdivisions and are also teardrop shaped. Here we have some that are banana or canoe shaped. So they vary greatly in their size, shape, and appearance. Why do you care? Because this is how we use characteristics in the lab to tell you what fungus we're dealing with. So when I look at that top one that has the brown color, I know that's alternaria. That's what causes that tomato leaf spot we looked at earlier at the very beginning. And when I look at the bottom one, that's fusarium. It's a common soil-borne fungus, causes a lot of problems with root rots. And we have special booklets that have information about different features of spores, and it tells you like what the name is and what it is. And then we know, okay, well this is fungus X, it has this type of life cycle, this type of biology, this is how we can deal with it. So I use spore features to identify fungi in the lab. That's why it's important. All right, so how do spores spread? So there's a lot of different ways. We'll start with something familiar, which is the mushroom. Mushrooms have a stalk like that. It looks kind of like a stem, but it's a stalk, a cap, and then on the underside of the cap you have these little bits called gills, and they're kind of flappy. So those gills are actually covered in these little structures that make spores. So the gills are covered in powdery spores. And I have another video for us. Right? Okay. So I usually skip through the slow part. Okay, so this is a mushroom. It's been grown in straw, and you can see the cap, so the camera is kind of like underneath the mushroom. And all of that dust-looking stuff, those are actually spores that are dropping off of the gills of the mushroom. So you can see there's literally millions of spores from a single mushroom. Now, most of these would drift off and land on like, a roadway, your car, a rock, just an unsuitable substrate. But a few will land on a suitable substrate, like soil or some, dead animal or something. And if it has a favorable temperature and adequate moisture, it'll start germinating a hyphae and colonize wherever it landed. But the vast majority of those are not going to go anywhere. They will physically go somewhere, but they're not going to grow, is what I mean, because they'll land somewhere unfortunate. Also, all my videos are from YouTube. I take no credit for them whatsoever. Okay.
Yeah.
I know, right?
like a lot of light.
All right, so let's look at something a little less familiar. This structure is the reproductive structure of cedar apple rust. It's actually one of 3 that it makes. This is on cedar, obviously, and it looks like a piece of brown clay globbed around a stem or branch. And when it matures, those orange horn-looking structures, they're kind of jelly-like, will poke out, and they're covered in spores similar to the gills on a mushroom. So given where that's at, that would definitely spread very well by wind, right? It probably wouldn't spread as far by water splash, right? But these spores will be carried on the wind to an apple tree where they can infect apple trees. Then apple trees will make 2 different types of spores, one of which will reinfect apple, and the third would reinfect cedar trees. So some life cycles are very complex and require multiple plant hosts. So that's why we care about the biology, because let's say you have a bunch of apple trees on your property and you have a line of cedar 10 feet away. You'd want to remove that cedar, right? Maybe replant with something else or get rid of the apples. All right, so something a little weirder even. Here we have a microscopic view on the bottom left that is around 200 to 250 times magnification. The green part That's plant cells. We're looking at the surface of a stem under a microscope. So the little black spiky thing that looks kind of like a sea urchin, you know, like one of those spiky little sea creatures, that's actually a reproductive structure of a fungus. Think way back to the cabbage, right? At the very beginning, those black dots that look like coffee grounds, that's the same thing. But this is on a spinach stem. So when we look at that, and no, wrong button, there we go. Okay, this is what it would look like drawn by an artist. So the bottom there is the plant cells, the rectangle cells, and then in the, there we go. So this is the bottom part of that black structure. It's kind of cup-shaped, and that's where it's budding off spores that are clones of itself. And here are little spikes. They look kind of like whisker-like. So this right here is actually that same fungus grown in a petri dish. And you can see those little black dots. And do you see that goopy wetness? That's actually spore ooze, where several of those little cup-shaped structures have made so many spores, it makes kind of a goop. So think about that. Would that spread very well with wind or water splash?
Water splash.
Yes. So the structure, like the physical shape and makeup of our reproductive structures, have a big impact in how these spores spread best. So understanding the biology of these, like their physical makeup and their life cycle, will really help us understand how to not spread them, right? So with that situation with Sarah Cabbage that had this problem, it might be helpful to make sure we either very carefully water around the ground or switch to drip irrigation, right? And not splash all over the leaves. But with the cedar apple rust, do we care if we splash on the leaves just for managing cedar apple rust? Wouldn't make a difference, right? I mean, you wouldn't want to for other reasons, but in a pretend bubble of just cedar apple rust, it wouldn't matter. All right. Oh, and there's a top view of that same structure taken with a really good hand lens that's like, I want to say it's 60x, 80x, something like that, maybe. It does kind of, but it's more moist, like in real life, than a tick. That sounds really gross. But, yeah, and you can see those little whisker-like, the spikes, the projections. So, all right. So here's your little note box. We already did the mushroom spore video. So to make things even more complicated, there are yet other survival structures that many fungus, not all, but many fungi make. The most common that I see are called sclerotia, and these are tough little pebble-like or nugget-like structures that are modified thickened hyphae that are super durable and tough and can last for years in the soil or in dead plant material in the ground. So this potato, if you look closely, you can see a white hyphae all over it, and then we have these little black specks or dark brown. Those are sclerotia. Those are tough, kind of glommed together, thick hyphae that are super, super hard. Like if you press on it, it feels like a rock almost. So if that potato were left in the ground and it rotted away, those sclerotia would still be there in 20 years to infect the next plant. So they're very, when I say tough and durable, they're very tough and durable. So they can last for a very long time in the soil, waiting around for another plant host in favorable conditions, right? So a lot of the soil-borne fungi that I see have this particular structure, which makes sense, right? That's highly advantageous if you can just hang around and wait a long time for another plant to grow there, right? So root rots like Rhizoctonia, charcoal rot, and cotton root rot, which we'll look at here in a second. Those all have sclerotia. Now here's a peep into the lab. This is a petri dish with a little stem piece that looked like it had some Rhizoctonia problems, which is the same thing that's infecting that potato. And you can see the stem there. And you see those little white flecks on there? Yeah. Or kind of beige colored? Those are baby sclerotia that are starting to form. So I can culture a lot of these things and look at them in the lab and look at their features under the microscope to get a better identification if I need to. So that's what we do when we say I cultured it in the lab. That's what we're doing. A little fun side fact, for experimental purposes, to store fungus, because I store fungus for years to use in future experiments, I know it's really weird, So I have a fungal collection, and so we actually grow this in a petri dish and starve it on purpose, so it uses up all the food in the petri dish, and then it starts making more and more sclerotia. So I'll collect probably 200 sclerotia off one petri plate. I put them in a little sterile envelope with my little sterile tweezers, seal it up, put it on the shelf, and as long as it's kept like cool and dry, it'll last for a long time. And I can, give some to a grad student if they need to do a project, or use it for my own research in the future. So there are a lot of things like that we do in the lab that most normal people don't get to see. But I think it's fun. I know, right? You would not believe the stuff I show people on my phone. Like, yeah. All right, so cotton root rot is a very common problem. It is through a lot of Texas, the Southwest, and Mexico. It's also known as Texas root rot. It was historically very problematic on cotton, hence the name. But it is a fungus that really likes high pH soil. Around 8 is ideal, 7.8 is great. Anything below 7, not so much. That's why we don't see it further north. Like, we get more acidic soils the further north we get. Like up here, you're seeing some more acidic soils. And the cold, it doesn't like cold. But anyway, it likes hot soil temperatures of over 85 degrees. Once we get those hot soil temperatures of 90 or above, which 2 summers ago, there were soil temperatures in Uvalde County that were over 100. Like, I had to go get an oven thermometer to measure 6 inches deep because it was maxing out my soil thermometer. And that was the worst year by far I've ever seen for cotton root rot. I saw it in places I didn't know it was before, so it really did well. So the hotter the better, clearly. And this can live for upward of 100 years in the soil due to those sclerotia. I know, right? So it has a really wide host range. It can infect hundreds of different plants. Thankfully, most of our natives are tolerant or immune, so planting with native plants is very helpful. A lot of our cultivated crops are susceptible, other than monocots, so anything grass-like, like wheat, corn, those are immune. But we always see a wilted and scorched appearance followed by death. The leaves will stay attached to the twig, and it will progress from a focal point out. It does make spores on these little thin crusts on the soil. That's called a spore mat, but the spores are sterile. It spreads primarily by mycelial growth through the soil. People move in soil around with like leveling sites, fill dirt, things like that. And like I said, the spores are sterile. It's weird.
How big is that mat?
Anywhere from 2 to 6 inches, probably as big as my hand. So here are some leaves that have stayed attached on this dying peach tree. So that's what I mean by dead leaves stay attached. They don't drop off like normal. And this is what I mean by it progresses from a focal point. It will grow out, like you can see the progress of the fungal colony, like getting bigger and bigger and bigger as the season progresses. And then it will eventually stop when it gets too cold. So
that's a cotton crop down right
yes.
at the coast.
Yes, that's Nueces County.
Yeah.
I think it's Nueces County. And that spot was probably, I'd say at least 40 yards wide. I'm really bad at gauging distances, but it was huge. Yes.
So if you have a tree that had that problem and you got to get rid of the tree, would that problem always be that spot?
It's there forever pretty much. Well. So because it is so prolific and long-lived in the soil, we really struggle to manage it. Replanting with natives is really the best, or grasses, or palms. But when you think you have it, you need to send a sample in promptly, because if it starts to rot, we can't see anything. So dig up roots promptly, send them in. And then I look for these very unique features of hyphae under the microscope, which you can see on that photo. Anthracnose is a very common garden issue. This is a group of fungus caused by Calototricum. This is the same thing that we looked at with the spore ooze and the little droplets, and the cabbage, same problem. It causes a variety of types of infections all over the plant. It really loves moisture, surprise, surprise. The more moist, the better. Consistent high humidity. And it doesn't have to be just rain, irrigation too, like, because you're basically creating pretend rain or artificial rain. So, and again, that's what it looks like from above with a good hand lens. So there are some prevention tips, some common sense things. All right, so fungal-like organisms. Back in the day, this used to be included closer to fungi, back when I was in high school. These are called oomycetes or water molds. Well, since the popularization of DNA sequencing technology and making it more affordable, we actually now know that genetically, and some other features too, but genetically, where's my mouse? There we go. Like, here are animals, here's fungi, here's plants, and oomycetes are out here by themselves. So this is a little map of how related things are on a genetic level. So they're pretty different, right? This includes Pythium, Phytophthora, downy mildew. All these are water molds or oomycetes, and they all have a unique means of spore dispersal. That's what Pythium looks like, and Phytophthora, and downy mildew. Oomycetes here in Texas, the most common that I see is Phytophthora blight of pepper. This causes some really severe symptoms on susceptible plants. You can see the deep sunken lesions on the stems. They're kind of chocolatey brown. It also infects the fruits and mummifies the fruits. This survives primarily in the soil and in dead crop debris. Like if that diseased pepper were to drop down on the ground and were left there to next year, it would carry it over to the next year. So we have those prevention tips in the box. Primarily, I suggest replant with resistant varieties. That's by far the best option. So one of my first samples ever was hydroponically grown wheatgrass. There was an operation that grew feed for deer, and they had these huge mats of, like square mats of wheatgrass, and they were rotting, and they couldn't figure out why. So this is what the roots look like on the bottom. Notice they're brown, kind of gross looking, rotted away, and you see a lot of sign, some hyphae. Notice this is a water mold, but we still use some of the same terminology as fungi. So I put it under the microscope, and I noticed these little spots in the root. So this is a root. And this is around 500 times magnification. This is the root. The kind of rectangle parallelogram shapes, those are root cells. So with a half-decent light microscope, you can see cells, right, of roots. And these little round structures are the reproductive structures of the water mold. So these are actually filled with, I promise we're getting close to the end, and then the rest is home reading. Another video. They're filled with these little things called zoospores. So these are very different than the spores we looked at on the mushroom. So here we have that little round structure. And this is happening in a thin layer of water under a microscope, and it's real time. Notice they swim away like a little animal, right? Hence the name zoo, like animal, zoo, spore. So they do have two flagella. They're just kind of clear flagella, and that's how they swim through the water. They're pretty fast.
Cockroaches.
Right? They're like vermin. So once they're loose, though, they don't just wander around. They actually do this thing called chemotaxis, where they have little sensors on the outside of their body, if you will, and they can actually detect the chemicals that come out from the tip of a root. So the tips of roots leak out a lot of like growth hormones and sugars and things like that. And these little guys can actually sense that on their little body. That's not the correct term, but you know, the body part. And so they can follow that strength of the signal or chemical signal to the root tip, just like you can follow your nose to baking bread or cookies, very similar. So they swim through the water and find the spot, and you can see there are some still ones there that have set up shop, if you will. It's called encyst, not like put your foot down, but like encapsulate, like E-N-C-Y-S-T. And at that point, they have some really huge metabolic changes, and they'll start germinating a hyphae that will penetrate into the root. So think about how much has to happen within that little thing to go from swimming around with flagella to encapsulating and growing a hyphae. Like the metabolic change and the signals that have to happen there are pretty remarkable. So that's very different from the mushroom that we looked at, right? Or the cedar apple rust. So that's just one part of why they're so different from fungus, and why they love moist standing water, and why they're the most problematic in moist standing water. Hold
I bet
on.
you have that as a picture hanging on your wall.
No, not that one. Actually,
1,000 people want to know, what is that?
Actually, I do have a large print of the Calotropicum anthracnose one? I have that, yeah. I know. All right. Okay, so here's an example of Pythium, and it's a very generalized disease cycle. Y'all can read that at home. But you can see on the soil there, it looks very moist and waterlogged. As you know, soil is not just a big block, right? It's lots of particles put together, and there are gaps between those particles. Usually that's filled with air, but when they're filled with water, those zoospores have a freeway to those roots. So that's why it thrives in waterlogged conditions or hydroponics. All right, diagnostics and exercises. Why do we care if you have an accurate diagnosis? Well, hopefully you've picked up along the way. It's really important to understand what we're dealing with so you know the appropriate steps to take so you don't waste your time. The process of that is ID the host plant, assess the problem, develop a suspect list, and narrow that list of suspects. Y'all are not going to be asked to do this on your test, but it's important for you to understand so you know what questions to ask people to gather information to give to a county agent or a specialist. So IDing the host plant, the main thing is just beware of common names. They're not geographically universal. Assessing the problem is pretty common sense. Examine the whole area as well as the individual plant. Look on the inside and the outside of the plant. Consider the site history. Ask a lot of questions. What type of recent weather events did you have? What's your fertility regimen? Did you have any sprays recently, like herbicide sprays nearby that could have drifted? How long has it been going on? And look at how many plants are affected and where they're distributed. You know, usually nature does not have hard lines or 90-degree angles. That's usually a good clue to like a spray injury or something like that. Nature will usually have a gradient of progression where you'll have some dead plants, dying plants, slightly less dying plants, and then fine plants. So you'll look for that progression to see if it's a disease issue. Developing your suspect list, this is where you're going to need more and more expertise with evaluating symptoms. There are a lot of reference books and things online. If you want to self-educate online, that is great, but just have a little ounce of skepticism with online. There's some really remarkable resources online, but there's a lot of absolute trash online too. So just proceed with caution. Narrow the list of suspects. This is where you need more and more expertise. This is where we're going to use more laboratory techniques and things like that. But a really great starting point that is more accessible for everyone is the Compendium series. They are kind of expensive, but they are a very well regulated series of books. The APS Press, this organization is made up of just plant pathologists. So to be published in these books, it's written by multiple experts, then at least 2 experts review it, proofread it, send back corrections, they're fixed. Then the editors send back corrections and they get fixed again. And then the senior editor does it again. So it has multiple layers of quality control and review. This is what I learned on as a grad student, and honestly, I still use these pretty regularly. They can be expensive, but a lot of classes will just buy one class book of like roses or something like that, so it makes it more affordable. All right, so let's say someone brings you leaves of multiple species. They have rough texture. It's on a lot of plants. There's yellowing. First, we're going to have to speed through these, I'm sorry. But first, you need to figure out what it is. So that was citrus. A lady brought me some citrus. She had like 50 trees. They're all similarly affected. And so host ID, and then what was the site history? Did you spray anything recently? Did neighbors spray anything? How many trees have it? Is there, a progression of symptoms? Are there some trees worse off than others? And ultimately, this was determined to be a severe case of spider mites. So sometimes what looks like a pathogenic issue can actually be an injury or disorder. So it can be a little difficult to tease out what's what. All right, so let's say someone brings you a whole plant. It has severe defoliation and wilting, and it's stunted. Here's what they look like. The 2 on the left are the sick plants. The one on the right is a normal plant for comparison. So what would you first ask the person? What is it? It's sesame. We actually grow a lot of sesame here in Texas. Then what would you do to the plant? We'd look it over. Look on the outside, look on the inside, take stock of the symptoms, right? So there's some obvious symptoms just on a large scale, but looking closer at the stems, the stem on the far left is a normal one. It's bright white on the inside. but the other stems, if you look at the outside, there's a really deeply sunken lesion. When I cut it open, it's really discolored inside. So I was really suspicious of some soil-borne fungi, the Rhizoctonia, like what we saw on that potato, and another one called charcoal rot. So I put some on some Petri plates, like this one, and I actually found that it actually had both Rhizoctonia root rot and charcoal root rot. So plant pathology is not always a single organism issue. Sometimes we have multiple organisms in play at once. All right, so disease management methods all have they're all going to affect some step in the disease cycle or the disease triangle. So keep that in mind as we go along. Resistant and immune plants, well, the first 4 focus on prevention. The last 2 are treatment. Now we'll go through them. Resistance and immunity is using genetics and traits of the plant to prevent disease from happening in the first place. You can see the difference here. The only difference between these plants is their genetics. They're exposed to the same amount of pathogen, the same environment. They're just genetically different. So the one that looks fine has the resistance gene that allows it to recognize the pathogen when it tries to infect and stop it. Do you remember way back when we talked about infection process? So that one has a gene to stop that process before it gets going. The other one does not. So it just let the pathogen sneak in and do its thing and colonize and reproduce. So it's by far the most effective option, most cost effective and work effective. Unfortunately, we do not have resistance for every pathogen in every crop. But when it is available, it's really good. Now there's another thing called indirect resistance that is not a resistance gene per se, and it's not going to have this level of effect, but it's some other feature like a thick waxy cuticle, for example, that has other purposes as well, like preventing sun scald, preventing like dust damage from windblown dust, reducing water loss, things like that. But it also can help prevent things like, fungi from being able to germinate and get through the epidermis because it's a thick layer of waxy cuticle, right? So the picture is showing direct resistance, which is genetic resistance. But there's also indirect resistance, which is not as effective, but it can be helpful. So if you come across those terms in the future, that's what they mean. Avoidance is manipulating your environment to avoid favorable conditions for disease. And there's a list of how we can do that, but the main one revolves around managing our water and regulating that water and making sure we don't have extremes. And also reducing splashing. Exclusion is keeping the pathogen out. This is pretty common sense. Inspect all your plants before they come in. Make sure you're not bringing in really diseased materials. And also make sure you keep clean tools, especially like shared things like rotary tillers and stuff like that. Make sure it's really clean before it goes place to place to place. The limitation here is obviously we can't control everything. There are pathogens that are going to blow in on the wind, for example. We can't stop the wind, obviously. But this is all about a numbers game where we're trying to stack the deck in our favor. Protection is when we use a barrier to protect the plant from the pathogen, and you can do this using a chemical, biological, or physical barrier. Chemical and biologicals are like putting like an invisible little raincoat on your plant to protect it, right? So just like if you were to put on a raincoat and stand outside 24/7 for 2 weeks, it's going to get some holes. That's why you have to reapply. That's why there's reapplication instructions. So make sure you follow that schedule, or otherwise you're not going to get the same level of protection. A physical barrier, that's pretty common sense. You're physically moving to another place. This is really great for if you have a particular variety that's really vulnerable to a particular disease that you know you have, but you still want to grow it. So it's really helpful for very specific situations. All right, eradication is killing and getting rid of the pathogen by removing or destroying diseased plant debris. This is also called sanitation or roguing. Back in the day, people could fumigate. Now we suggest biofumigating paired with solarization, or solarization alone. Solarization is a process where you put plastic over the soil, well, you water it to get it wet, put plastic over the soil, let it get hot in the sun for a certain amount of time, and it kills a lot of the pathogens, as well as weed seeds. So it's a really great tool if you already have a problem. And biofumigating is, most people for homeowners will just go ahead and grow mustards there and then till it under, and you have to wait like 4 to 6 weeks for them to decompose before you can plant. Right, therapy is helping the plant to heal after you have a problem, using primarily systemic chemicals, followed by pruning or paired with pruning. Like we mentioned on the rose dieback, you wouldn't just spray and hope it's going to be fine. You need to prune out the disease material, then spray to try to remove as much of the pathogen infested plant material as possible, then do that fungicide application to cover anything you might have missed. All right. All right, IPM, have you guys talked about that yet? Mm-hmm. Okay, so there's some little home reading. So other issues like abiotic problems are by far the most common in terms of how often they occur, because only one event has to happen. We don't have to fulfill the full disease triangle, right? And here are some examples of those that I see pretty often. Herbicide, like one note about herbicide damage is that plants like the citrus here, notice how like it looks like a leaf spot at first, but if you really look, it has a very clean, sharp margin, and there's no discoloration, there's no water soaking. So to my eye, that's like a red flag for herbicide damage, because it doesn't have any of the markers. No sign, no water soaking, no yellowing, no progression of the spot getting bigger and bigger. So that's an abiotic problem. Now, a misconception I encounter often is that the bigger the plant, the more herbicide it can tolerate. That is not true, not at all. Some really large plants are very sensitive to certain herbicides, right? So don't let size mislead you, especially around trees in your yard. Thinking, oh, this oak tree is massive, it can handle a little Roundup. No, do not. No. It's, I would say one of the top 10 calls I get is people are like, well, I thought it'd be fine. I'm like, no, it's not fine. Okay, arthropod pests, I know just enough to point you roughly in the right direction. Molly Keck and Wheezy Brown are great. They're entomology specialists. I just include this slide so you have their info. The key there with management is on schedule. If you choose to spray, stay on schedule with your sprays and rotate them appropriately. Sooty mold is not really a parasitic fungus, even though it looks horrible. It's actually on the surface of the leaf, and it's feeding on insect excretions. So once you get your insects under control, this will go away. Parasitic plants are a common issue that I get calls about. True parasites like dodder, which are these vines, and mistletoe actually penetrate into the host using these specialized little structures that you can see on the bottom there. And they steal nutrients, so they're a true parasite. Now, moss balls on that far left photo are often mistaken for parasites, but they're not. They're epiphytes. They're actually in the same genus as those cute little air plants you buy at the store, at least I buy at the store. So they're living on it. They're not actually stealing food from it. So, but some people don't like them, and you can treat them with the listed methods there. For the true parasites, removal or herbicide application is the only way to get rid of them, like physical removal. And you can't just, like with mistletoe, you can't just pull it off. And like you have to cut the whole stem, because essentially the root structures are deep into the limb or branch, and you have to cut that off or it'll regrow.
Like they have in Georgia?
Oh, yeah, like Spanish moss. Yes. Yeah. It's the same, actually I think it's the same genus as the little air plants and moss balls. If it's not the same genus, it's really close, like certainly in the same family. But they're also epiphytes. They're super cute. I love them. They're super cute. I love them. I love all epiphytes pretty much. Well, I know. All right. So resources available. Y'all have some great stuff at AgriLife Extension. I'm there, not to toot my own horn, but just saying. Also Kevin Ong, he's our ornamental specialist. He's great. He's also the director of the clinic in College Station and my boss. So if you have any complaints, take it up with him. They have some really great instructional videos on the website for the Plant Disease Lab. They also have a really cool Facebook and Instagram page where they have little informational posts, usually twice a week, like What Wednesday and Fact Friday. So they just have cool things, like educational things. I also have Plant Dr. Kim on Facebook and Instagram. Mine's a little more variety, so there's a lot of plant stuff, there's a lot of fungus stuff. And then there's also going to be updates on the occasional chickens of Walmart and Uvalde, maybe a stray emu or two. We do have a stray emu in Uvalde that's been stray for like 5 years. It gets sighted like 3 times a year, so I like to post updates about the stray emu sometimes. All right, sample shipping tips. Resource websites are listed here. There's a wide variety, including the A&M resources right there. And there's a little home activity for fun if you like the mushroom stuff. Making spore prints like this on paper is actually one way that we catalog mushrooms for mushroom collections. So that's pretty cool. All right, so there's my contact info, and my email is usually the best way to get a hold of me. I'm not in my office a lot. I travel a lot. So yeah, I get email on my phone. And if you send me an email and I don't reply back in a couple days, just send a follow-up nudge, because it means I saw it and thought, I need to think about that to reply, and then I forgot, or my kid had my phone and dismissed the notification. So if I don't get back to you promptly, just bug me and I will get back to you. And that is all for today. Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
You are so welcome.
Okay, briefly.